I don't want your money, Clara. I never did. Samuel Dawson's voice cracked as he slammed the letter onto the kitchen table. A letter bearing the seal of the Whitmore estate worth more than every ranch in Wyoming combined. His hands were shaking. Not from anger. From something far worse. Betrayal. The woman standing across from him, the quiet orphan girl he had married 3 months ago. The woman he had begun to love was not who she said she was, and the whole town was about to find out the truth before he did. If this story already has your heart racing, subscribe to our channel, follow along until the very end, and drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Wyoming Territory, 1885. Samuel Dawson hadn't slept properly in 4 days. It wasn't the cold. Wyoming winters were brutal, and Samuel had learned to sleep through cold a long time ago. It wasn't hunger either, though supper had been thin for weeks. Hard biscuits, black coffee, whatever scraps he could put together after paying what he owed on the feed bill. No. What kept Samuel awake was something worse than cold or hunger. It was the silence. The particular kind of silence that lived inside a house where someone used to be. His wife Margaret had died 6 years ago. Fever took her too fast for the doctor to arrive. Too fast for Samuel to do anything except hold her hand and watch the light go out of her eyes. He had buried her on the hill behind the barn, beneath the cottonwood tree. She always said, had the prettiest branches in the territory. He still walked past that tree every morning. He still took his hat off when he did. 6 years of mornings. 6 years of hat in hand. 6 years of silence. The ranch had suffered for it. Not because Samuel stopped working, he never stopped working. The man was made of work. His hands told the story clearly enough. Cracked knuckles, calloused palms, fingernails that never quite came fully clean, no matter how hard he scrubbed. Samuel Dawson worked from before sunlight until well after dark, and he did it every single day without complaint. But a ranch needed more than one person's effort. That was the plain truth he'd been refusing to look at for 6 years. He had 2 ranch hands. Old Pete Garland, who was pushing 60 and moved slower every winter, and a young boy named Hector Cruz, 17 years old and willing, but still learning. 3 people to run what had once been a thriving cattle operation under Samuel's father. The herd had shrunk. The east pasture fencing needed replacing. The root cellar had flooded last spring, and he'd lost 3 months of preserved food. The bank held a note against the north grazing land, not a large note, but large enough to cause Samuel to lie awake staring at the ceiling, and there was nobody to talk to about any of it. That was the real problem. Not the debts, not the fencing, not the depleted herd. The loneliness had started eating at him from the inside, the way dry rot eats at timber slowly and visibly, until one day the whole structure was weaker than it looked. Thomas Reed was the one who finally said it out loud. Thomas was Samuel's oldest friend. They'd grown up 3 farms apart, learned to ride together, gotten into the same stupid fights, and talked each other out of the same stupid decisions for 30 years. Thomas ran a successful supply business in Redstone Valley and had a wife, 4 children, and a laugh that could shake the walls of any building he was in. He came out to the ranch on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, said he was checking on a fence post order, but Samuel knew better. Thomas had been watching him carefully for months. They sat on the porch with tin cups of coffee, and Thomas looked out at the property for a long time without saying anything. Samuel knew that look. It was the look that meant Thomas was building up to something he figured Samuel wasn't going to like. "You need a wife," Thomas said finally. Samuel didn't answer right away. "I had one," he said. "You had Margaret. That's not what I mean, and you know it." Thomas set his cup down. "I'm not asking you to forget her. Nobody's asking you that. I'm saying that ranch is dying, Sam. Not because you're lazy, because one man can't run it alone, and you know that too. I've got Pete and Hector. Pete's back goes out every February, and Hector still doesn't know which end of a calf to pull." Thomas turned and looked at him directly. "I'm serious. You need a partner. Someone who can actually run a household and help manage things. The kind of help that actually stays." Samuel stared into his coffee cup for a long time. "I wouldn't even know how to start that conversation. he said quietly. Thomas reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the porch railing between them without a word. Samuel looked at it but didn't pick it up. "What is that?" "Marriage agency out of St. Louis. A man in Cheyenne used them last year. His wife turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to his operation." Thomas stood up and stretched his back. "I'm not telling you what to do, Sam, but I am telling you that there's no prize for suffering alone." He walked to his horse, mounted up, and rode back toward town. Samuel sat on that porch for another hour before he picked up the paper. He didn't write the letter that night. He didn't write it the next night either. He folded the paper and put it in the top drawer of his desk, underneath his land documents and Margaret's Bible, and he told himself he was only keeping it because throwing it away felt rude. But he thought about it. He thought about it while he was mending fence in the cold. He thought about it while he was doing the feed calculations that never quite added up right anymore. He thought about it at night, lying in the dark, listening to the wind, when the silence in the house felt so heavy it had its own weight. 3 weeks later, he wrote the letter. He kept it simple, honest. He wasn't the kind of man who knew how to dress things up with fancy words, so he didn't try. "My name is Samuel Dawson. I am 38 years old. I own and operate a cattle ranch outside Redstone Valley, Wyoming Territory. The ranch has seen better years, but I am working to improve it. I am looking for a capable, practical woman, willing to work hard and build something honest. I am not wealthy. I am not charming. But I am reliable, and I keep my word. If that means anything to you, write back." He almost didn't send it. He read it over twice, decided it sounded desperate, rewrote it, decided the rewrite sounded worse, and finally sent the original before he could change his mind again. He figured nothing would come of it. Something came of it. 6 weeks after he sent the letter, a reply arrived. The handwriting was neat and careful, not the looping decorative script some women use to show they'd had proper schooling. This was practical handwriting, the kind that said, "I write to communicate, not to impress. Dear Mr. Dawson, your letter was the most honest one I have received from this agency, and I have received 17. Most men describe themselves as prosperous when they mean struggling, or as handsome when they mean passable. You described yourself accurately, which tells me something about your character. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 24 years old. I am an orphan with no family remaining. I have no dowry and no property to bring to a marriage. What I do have is practical intelligence, a willingness to work, and an understanding that hardship is not the same thing as failure. If those qualities are useful to you, I am willing to discuss this further. Respectfully, Clara Whitmore." Samuel read the letter 3 times. Then he walked to the barn, stood next to his oldest horse for a while, and said to no one in particular, "Well, all right then." He wrote back that afternoon. They exchanged 4 more letters over the following month. Nothing romantic about any of them. They discussed practicalities, the size of the ranch, the nature of the work, the condition of the house, what a typical week looked like. Clara asked specific questions that surprised him. What is the current debt balance against the property? What is the approximate size of the herd, and what have the losses been over the past 2 winters? Is the water source reliable year-round? After her 3rd letter, Samuel showed it to Thomas. Thomas read it slowly, then looked up. "Sam," he said carefully, "are you sure this is a woman and not an accountant?" Samuel almost smiled. "Could be both." "What do you know about her? Where she's from, what her life's been like?" "She's an orphan. Parents died when she was young. She's been managing on her own since then. Doesn't say much more than that." Samuel folded the letter. "She answers every question I ask, but she's careful about what she volunteers." "That bother you?" Samuel thought about it honestly. "No," he said finally. "Everybody's got things they carry quiet. I understand that." Thomas gave him a long look. Don't let that be an excuse not to ask Sam. But Samuel was already writing the next letter. The stagecoach arrived on a Thursday morning in early November, And half of Redstone Valley was out to watch it the way half of Redstone Valley was always out to watch anything that qualified as an event. Samuel stood at the edge of the road, hat in his hands, wearing the cleanest shirt he owned. He'd shaved that morning, which he didn't always bother to do. He felt faintly ridiculous standing there, and he could see Thomas on the boardwalk with his wife Eleanor, both of them watching with unconcealed interest. The coach door opened. A woman stepped down. She was smaller than he'd imagined. Not fragile-looking, but compact. Economical somehow was the word that came to his mind. Like every part of her was exactly what it needed to be and nothing extra. She wore a dark traveling dress that had been mended carefully at the left cuff, which Samuel noticed because he noticed things like that. Her hair was pinned back simply. Her face was calm in a way that wasn't coldness, it was control. Like a person who had learned a long time ago that showing too much made you a target. She carried one small suitcase. That was all. She stepped onto the road, looked around the town for a moment, then found him standing at the edge of the crowd and walked directly toward him without hesitation. "Mr. Dawson," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He reached for her suitcase. "Welcome to Redstone Valley." Behind him, he could already hear the whispers starting. Is that who he sent for? She doesn't look like much. He can't even keep that ranch alive. Why would she come here? Poor girl doesn't know what she's walking into. Clara heard it. Samuel could see it in the slight shift of her jaw, the almost imperceptible lift of her chin. She heard every word, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Samuel steadily and said, "I hope we can build something honest together, Mr. Dawson." It was such a plain, simple sentence, but something about the directness of it hit Samuel somewhere he hadn't expected. "That's all I'm asking for," he said, and he picked up her suitcase and started walking toward the wagon. The drive out to the ranch took 40 minutes. They didn't fill the time with small talk. Samuel had never been good at small talk, and he didn't try to fake it now. After a few minutes of silence, he thought he should probably apologize for it. "I'm not much of a talker," he said. "I noticed," Clara said. "A beat." "I don't mind." Another long stretch of quiet. "The house needs work," Samuel said. "I want you to know that before you see it. I've been keeping it clean, but I haven't done much beyond that. It's functional." "I didn't come for decoration," Clara said. "The cold comes in through the north window in the bedroom. I've been meaning to fix it. Haven't gotten to it yet." "I'll fix it." Samuel glanced sideways at her. "You know how to seal a window?" "I know how to solve problems," she said. "That includes windows." He looked back at this road, didn't say anything for a moment. "That was in your letter," he said. "It's also true." When they pulled up to the ranch house, Samuel watched her face. He'd learned to watch faces when he was a boy. His father had been unpredictable, and knowing how to read a person's expression fast had been important. He'd never lost the habit. Clara looked at the house carefully, the weathered wood, the patched roof, the leaning fence along the side, the barn that needed new boards on the east wall. She looked at all of it. Her expression didn't fall. She didn't fake enthusiasm either. She wasn't the kind of woman who said, "Oh, it's wonderful," about something that wasn't wonderful. Instead, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Where does the main water supply come from?" Samuel blinked. "The well out back. It runs reliable except in deep freeze." "And the root cellar?" "North side of the house. Flooded last spring. I rebuilt the drainage, but I'm not fully confident in it yet." Clara nodded slowly, taking inventory in her head. The eastern fence line, those posts were visible from the road. "How much of it needs replacing?" "About 60 yards. "And the herd? What do you have right now?" 43 cattle. Was near 92 years back." He said it plainly without embarrassment, though it still stung. She nodded again. "All right?" "All right." He studied her. "That's it." Clara turned and looked at him for the first time since they'd stopped. "Mr. Dawson, I grew up with nothing. I have worked in houses where the roof leaked and the pantry was empty more often than not. I have lived in circumstances that most people would call impossible. What I see here," she gestured at the ranch, is a property with problems that have solutions. That's very different from impossible. Samuel stared at her. You came from orphanages, he asked. Something shifted in her expression. Very briefly. So brief, he almost missed it. Among other places, she said. I managed. And she picked up her suitcase herself, walked to the front door, and let herself in. The first week was the most important week. Samuel had expected he wasn't sure what he'd expected. Adjustment, maybe. A period where things were awkward and careful, some version of two strangers circling each other politely. What he got was something else entirely. Clara moved through the house on that first morning like she was solving a puzzle. She opened every cabinet, checked every supply, looked at every record Samuel had on the property, without asking permission, but also without apology. When she found his ledger, the record of debts and expenses he kept in the desk, she sat down at the table and read it cover to cover. Samuel watched from the doorway. You don't have to. What's this line here? She pointed at an entry from 8 months ago. $60 to the Caldwell Bank. Is that a payment on the note or a separate debt? Separate. I had to borrow against the spring planting. Feed prices doubled. And you paid it back. Mostly, still owe $40. She nodded, made a note on the margin in her neat, careful handwriting. And the main note on the north grazing land. What's the total left on that? Samuel pulled up a chair. If she was going to do this, he might as well do it properly. They spent 2 hours going through the ledger together. By the end of it, Samuel felt something he hadn't felt about the ranch finances in a long time, like there might actually be a path forward. Not because the numbers were suddenly better, they weren't. But because the way Clara looked at them methodically, without panic, with the same calm focus she seemed to bring to everything, made the problem feel manageable instead of overwhelming. The north field, she said, finally closing the ledger. You're underutilizing it. The herd's too small to make use of all of it right now. That's backwards thinking. She wasn't harsh about it, just direct. You need to get the herd larger to use the field. But to get the herd larger, you need to use the field's revenue potential differently. Have you considered leasing the grazing rights on the north quarter to another rancher? Just for this season, while your herd builds back. Samuel was quiet for a moment. I hadn't thought of that, he said honestly. The Harmon brothers have a larger herd than their land can support right now. I heard them discussing it at the dry goods store when I arrived yesterday. She stood up and put the ledger back on the desk. Suggest a lease arrangement. It brings in income without selling anything, and it builds goodwill. She walked to the window and looked out at the property. Samuel sat at the table and looked at her back, and he had the strange, disorienting feeling of being a person who had been lost in the dark for a long time, and then someone had walked into the room and simply turned on the lamp. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just light where there hadn't been any before. Old Pete noticed first. He came to Samuel at the end of the first week, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. Boss, he said, that wife of yours. What about her? She came out to the east fence this morning, while me and Hector were working. Pete looked like he wasn't sure how to arrange his face. She had questions. What kind of questions? Good questions is the thing. Pete scratched the back of his neck. She wanted to know why we were patching that section instead of replacing it. I told her we didn't have the lumber budget for full replacement. She asked me what it costs every time a section fails and we lose cattle onto the neighboring property. I said I wasn't sure. She said we should find out. He paused. She was right. When I figured it, we lose more in cattle drift and retrieval than the lumber would have cost. Samuel looked at him for a moment. So replace the fence. Yes, sir. Pete shifted. She's not what I expected. What did you expect? I don't know, somebody quieter. Samuel almost smiled. She's not quieter. No, sir. Pete put his hat back on. She sees things that one. Things you miss when you're too close to the problem. Samuel nodded slowly. He already knew. Thomas came out to the ranch on the second Saturday. His stated reason was returning a borrowed tool, but Samuel knew Thomas well enough to understand that the tool was a pretext. He wanted to see for himself. He found Clara in the barn, in conversation with Hector about feed rotation schedules. She had a piece of paper with a chart drawn on it, and she was explaining it to the boy with the patient, clear manner of someone who knew how to teach, without making the student feel inferior. Thomas watched from the barn door for a minute before she noticed him. When she did, she acknowledged him with a calm nod. "Mr. Reed, Samuel's spoken well of you. Has he—" Thomas looked surprised. "He doesn't speak well of many people. He said you were the most straightforwardly honest man he knew, which he considers the highest compliment." Thomas glanced at Samuel, who was leaning against the far wall, doing a very unconvincing impression of a man who hadn't heard this. Thomas looked back at Clara. "He's right that I'm straightforward, so I'll be straight with you. Everyone in town is wondering what a capable young woman with no roots anywhere is doing out here on a struggling ranch with a man twice her age." Clara met his eyes without blinking. "He's not twice my age." 14 years then. 13 and a half. A ghost of something, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "And the answer to your question is that I came here because this arrangement made sense to me. Mr. Dawson was honest about who he was and what he needed. I found that appealing. Most people are not honest about either." Thomas studied her for a long moment. Then he looked at Samuel again. "I like her," he announced. "I know," Samuel said. The first real crack appeared at the end of the third week. Samuel was at the desk late at night, going through the feed cost projections Clara had put together. They were good, better than his own, and he'd been building on them when he heard the sound of something sliding under the door. He frowned, got up, and found an envelope on the floor. Not the front door. The door to the small room he used as an office, which was at the back of the house. Which meant someone had been inside the house to push it under. He opened it. It was a short note printed in block letters. "The orphan girl is not what she says. Ask her about the Whitmore name." Samuel read it twice. He stood very still for a moment. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and went to bed. But he didn't sleep. He lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the letters that arrived for Clara every few weeks from cities far away. Thinking about the way she went carefully quiet whenever they arrived. Thinking about the things she'd said in the barn their first week. "I grew up with nothing," among other places. "I managed." The slight shift in her expression when she said it. Ask her about the Whitmore name. He didn't know that name. He didn't know what it meant, but something in his gut told him it meant something large. He lay awake until the sky started to go gray, and in the morning, he watched her across the breakfast table, the way she moved efficiently through the kitchen, the way she looked at the ledger she'd left open on the counter, the way she was always thinking, and he said nothing about the note. Not yet. Because Samuel Dawson had learned a long time ago that the truth, when it mattered, had a way of finding its own moment. He just didn't know how close that moment already was. Wham! It was Thomas who came to him 4 days later, and Thomas who looked genuinely troubled for the first time in the 20 years Samuel had known him. He arrived at noon, tied his horse fast, and came straight to where Samuel was working in the yard without any of his usual pleasantries. "Edwin Caldwell," Thomas said. Samuel straightened up. Edwin Caldwell was the owner of Redstone Valley's only bank. A careful, calculating man who Samuel had always dealt with politely and trusted exactly as far as he needed to. "What about him?" "He's asking around town about Clara." Thomas dropped his voice even though there was no one near them. "Not casually, specifically. He went to the telegraph office yesterday and sent 3 wires, to Boston, to Philadelphia, to New York." Samuel said nothing. "Sam." Thomas looked at him hard. "What do you know about her? What she came from?" "She said she's an orphan, no family." "Caldwell doesn't seem to believe that." "Why does Caldwell care?" "That's the question, isn't it?" Thomas shook his head. "Whatever he's looking for, he's looking hard. And he's doing it quietly, which means he doesn't want her to know." He paused. "I thought you should." Samuel picked up his work gloves from the fence post. "Thank you," he said. "That's all you're going to say? For now." Thomas stared at him. Sam, if that woman is hiding something, she hasn't done anything dishonest since she got here, Samuel said quietly. She's worked harder than most people I've known. She's helped this ranch more in 3 weeks than I managed alone in a year. He looked at Thomas. Everybody is hiding something, Tom. You know that. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Just be careful, he said finally. I'm always careful, Samuel said, but his hand closed around the work glove was not quite steady. That night a letter arrived. He saw it on the table when he came in from the evening chores, a thick envelope, city postmark Boston this time. Clara was in the kitchen, and she came to the table quickly. When she saw it, picked it up with hands that were not quite casual, not quite rushed. He watched her face. There it was again, that careful blankness, that controlled expression that wasn't coldness and wasn't calm. It was the face of someone working very hard not to show what they were feeling. From a friend, he asked. She looked at him, a beat too long. From a lawyer, she said. Yours? Another beat. Yes, she said. And she took the letter to her room and closed the door. Samuel stood at the table for a long moment. He pulled the note from his shirt pocket, he'd been carrying it for 4 days, and set it on the table in front of him. The orphan girl is not what she says. Ask her about the Whitmore name. He looked at it for a while. Then he got up, poured himself a cup of coffee, and made himself wait. Because whatever the truth was, whatever the Whitmore name meant, whatever those letters carried, whatever Clara Whitmore was carrying silent inside her, he had meant what he said on the drive out from town. He wanted to build something honest, and honest things he had learned could not be forced. They had to be ready. But readiness in Redstone Valley was a luxury. Because 2 days later, a man arrived on the morning stagecoach. Samuel was in town picking up supplies when the coach pulled in. He saw the man step out and knew immediately, the way you sometimes know things about a person before you've spoken a word, that this man was trouble. He was somewhere in his 40s. Well dressed in the Eastern way, all polished buttons and pressed cloth that had no business being in a Wyoming street. His face was handsome, in a calculated sort of way, the kind of handsome that had been practiced in front of a mirror. His eyes moved around the town, quickly assessing, measuring the way a man's eyes moved when he was used to walking into situations he'd already decided how to control. He spoke to the stagecoach driver briefly, then turned and walked directly toward the hotel, carrying his bag himself, like a man who had never needed to ask for help and didn't intend to start. Samuel watched him from across the street. He didn't know that man's name yet, but he felt somewhere in the deep practical center of his chest the same feeling he got when he watched storm clouds building on the western horizon. Something was coming, something that had already been in motion for a long time, and it was moving toward Clara. He drove back to the ranch faster than he needed to. When he pulled in, Clara was in the yard talking to Pete about the North Fence project. She looked up when she heard the wagon, and something about the speed of his return registered on her face. "Is everything all right?" she asked. Samuel climbed down from the wagon. He looked at her for a moment, at this woman who had come into his broken-down life with her practical hands and her careful eyes and her city letters and her secrets. This woman who had turned a struggling ranch into something that might actually survive, this woman who looked at him like she was still deciding whether to trust him completely. "A man got off the morning coach," he said. He watched her face. He saw it. The color didn't drain from her face. Clara had too much control for that, but her stillness changed. The way a person's stillness changes when something they've been dreading stops being a distant possibility and becomes something real. "What did he look like?" she asked carefully. Samuel described him. Clara said nothing for a long moment. Her hands at her sides closed slowly into fists, and then she said 4 words in a voice that was so controlled it was almost frightening. "Then it's time." "Time for what?" Samuel asked. She looked at him directly, the way she always did, but this time with something underneath it that he hadn't seen before. Something that might have been, if he was reading her correctly, the beginning of a decision. "For the truth," she said. "And in the cold November air of the Wyoming Territory, with the north wind picking up and the cottonwood tree on the hill." Bending in it, Samuel Dawson looked at his wife of 3 weeks and understood that the story he thought he was living was about to become something else entirely. Something larger. Something he hadn't seen coming. Something that was going to change everything he thought he knew about the orphan girl he married. Her name had always been the most dangerous thing she carried. Clara understood that before she was old enough to understand most things. She had learned it the hard way, the way orphan children learn most important lessons, not from a classroom or a kind teacher, but from the sharp, unforgiving edge of experience. From watching people's faces change the moment they heard it. From understanding very young that a name could be a key that unlocked doors or a chain that locked you inside someone else's plans for your life. The Whitmore name had always been both depending on who was doing the hearing. She had not used it in 3 years. She had been Clara of no particular family for 3 years. Clara who managed on her own. Clara who asked careful questions and kept her own counsel and moved quietly through the world without drawing the kind of attention that came with 3 years of lawyers' letters and distant cousins appearing out of nowhere and men like Nathaniel Pierce deciding that her future was actually their business. She had been so careful. And now Nathaniel Pierce was in Redstone Valley, Wyoming Territory, standing in some hotel room, probably already deciding how this was going to go. She stood in the yard after Samuel drove the wagon to the barn, and she made herself breathe evenly. In through the nose, out through the mouth, the way she had taught herself to do when she was 13 years old, and the ground was falling out from under her, and she had nobody to hold on to. She had come west specifically to avoid this moment. She had chosen Wyoming because it was far. She had chosen a marriage agency because an ordinary marriage to an ordinary man was the one thing Nathaniel Pierce and his lawyers could not easily dismantle. She had chosen Samuel Dawson because his letter was honest, and because an honest man was the only kind she had any use for. What she had not anticipated was that she would actually come to respect him. What she had not anticipated, and this was the part that sat uncomfortably in her chest, was that respect was starting to become something else, something warmer and considerably more complicated. She went inside and sat at the table with the letter from her lawyer that had arrived from Boston 2 days ago, the one she hadn't let herself fully process yet, and she read it again. "Miss Whitmore, I must inform you that Nathaniel Pierce has filed a petition with the court in Boston claiming mismanagement of the estate in your absence. He is arguing that your departure west constitutes abandonment of your legal and financial responsibilities. His legal team is competent, and his argument, while I believe it to be wrong, is not frivolous. More urgently, our correspondent suggests he has located your general whereabouts. I would advise you to be prepared. Be prepared." 3 decades of her lawyer's careful, measured letters, and the best he could offer was be prepared. She folded the letter and put it back in its envelope. Then she picked up a blank sheet of paper and wrote down everything she needed to think through, because that was how she handled fear. She made it visible, broke it into pieces, and dealt with each piece in order. It was the only method that had ever reliably worked. She was halfway through her list when the kitchen door opened and Samuel came in. He crossed to the counter, poured himself a cup of coffee from the pot, and sat down across from her without asking if she wanted company. He did that sometimes. He didn't ask permission to be in the same room, which she appreciated, because men who asked permission to be in the same room as her usually wanted something in return for the asking. He looked at the paper in front of her. He didn't try to read it. "You going to tell me?" he said. Clara set down her pencil. She looked at him across the table. This was the moment. She had known it was coming for 3 weeks. She had been building toward it and running from it simultaneously, which was an exhausting way to exist. "How much do you want to know?" she asked. "Everything," Samuel said. No hesitation. "I'm not interested in pieces." She studied him for a moment, the rough hands around the coffee cup, the steady, patient eyes that never seemed to be performing anything, never working to look understanding or trustworthy the way some men did. He simply was what he was, and he looked at you the same way, whether you were the governor or the stable boy. It was the most disarming quality she had ever encountered in a person. "My father's name was Robert Whitmore," she said. She watched for the flicker, the recognition, the way people's eyes changed when they heard it. Samuel's eyes didn't change. He just waited. He built a shipping and trade company in Boston starting in 1851. By the time he died 14 years ago, it was one of the 5 largest private commercial enterprises in the Northeast. The estate, the money, the properties, the holdings was worth approximately $3 million. She said the number plainly the way she'd learned to say it, without drama, without apology. Samuel was very still. "3 million, he said. "At the time of his death. It has grown since then." She folded her hands on the table. "I was 10 years old when my father died. My mother had died the year before. I had no siblings. That made me the sole heir. It also made me an extremely inconvenient child for a great many people." "Inconvenient how?" Samuel asked. "An orphaned 10-year-old who controls a $3 million estate cannot actually control it, legally or practically, which means other people control it on her behalf." Clara kept her voice even. "My father had a business partner, Nathaniel Pierce. He was appointed as trustee of the estate until I came of age." Samuel said nothing. He was listening the way good listeners listened, completely without preparing his response. "Nathaniel managed the estate for 8 years, Clara continued. "He was efficient. He was professional. He was also, I discovered when I turned 18 and began looking at the records myself, systematically overcharging the estate for his management services and directing portions of my father's company profits into a separate holding company that he controlled. He was stealing from you, carefully, legally adjacent stealing, the kind that takes a very good lawyer to trace and a very expensive lawsuit to address." She looked at her folded hands. "I hired that lawyer. I filed that lawsuit when I was 20. Nathaniel did not take it well. What did he do? He made my life very difficult for 2 years. He used his control of the trust to delay my access to funds. He challenged my competency in court twice. He used his considerable social connections to make things professionally and personally unpleasant." Her voice stayed level, but something around her eyes tightened. "He is a man who believes that persistence and power are essentially the same thing, and that both can be used to exhaust an opponent until they give up." "But you didn't give up," Samuel said. "No." "So why did you leave?" Clara was quiet for a moment. "Because I won," she said. "The court ruled in my favor. The lawsuit was settled 18 months ago. The estate is legally mine entirely and without dispute." She looked up at him. "And then I realized that winning had cost me almost everything I had aside from the money. I had no relationships that weren't contaminated by 3 years of legal warfare. I had no life that wasn't constructed entirely around fighting for what was already mine. I had been Clara Whitmore heiress for 24 years, and I had never once been allowed to simply be a person." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up again, that low, constant Wyoming wind that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "So you came west," Samuel said. "I came west, and I found a marriage agency. And I specifically chose a man who described himself as not wealthy and not charming, because I had been surrounded my entire life by wealthy, charming men, and I found them all exhausting." She met his eyes. "And I chose not to tell him the truth, because I needed just once, just for a little while, to know that someone could see me as a person before they knew what I was worth." Samuel put his coffee cup down. He looked at the table for a long moment. "And the man who got off the stagecoach this morning," he said slowly, "that's Nathaniel Pierce." "Yes." "And he's here because winning a lawsuit doesn't stop a man like Nathaniel. It just makes him reorganize." Her voice went flat in a specific way. Not cold, but the tone of someone who had said a thing so many times it no longer carried surprise. "He's filed a new petition in Boston, claiming that my departure from the East constitutes abandonment. He's arguing that a young woman who abandons her estate to marry a struggling rancher in Wyoming has demonstrated she's incapable of managing her own affairs. Samuel looked up at her. He's using me, Samuel said. Not a question. He's using our circumstances, Clara said. The struggling ranch, the debts, the appearance of impulsive decision-making. She paused. I want you to know that I never thought of you as... I know, Samuel said. She stopped. He said it so simply. No qualification, no demand for reassurance. Just I know, like he had decided it was true, and that was the end of that. She had not been prepared for that. She had prepared very carefully for anger. She had prepared for the wounded pride of a man who felt deceived. She had prepared for demands and recriminations, and the particular male fury of someone who felt they'd been made to look foolish. She had scripts for all of those responses. She had been running them in her head for weeks. She had not prepared for I know, said quietly with nothing behind it except basic human decency. She felt something shift in her chest that she did not immediately have a name for. Samuel, she said. You should have told me sooner, he said. Not hard, just honest. I could have helped. You might have behaved differently if you'd known. Probably, he admitted. But different doesn't always mean worse. He looked at her steadily. What do you need right now? Not eventually. Right now. Clara looked at the list in front of her. The careful, itemized list of problems and responses. I need to know whether Nathaniel has already contacted Edwin Caldwell, she said. Samuel reached into his shirt pocket. He set a folded note on the table between them. Clara looked at it. Then she looked at him. How long have you had that? She asked. 4 days. She picked it up and read it. Her expression didn't change, but a muscle along her jaw moved. He works fast, she said. Who do you think sent it? Nathaniel wouldn't send an anonymous note. He'd deliver bad news to your face because he enjoys watching people react. She set the note back down. Someone else. Someone in town who knows something and wanted you warned. She thought for a moment. Or wanted me warned through you. Thomas came to me 3 days ago, Samuel said. He said Caldwell had been sending telegrams to Boston, Philadelphia, New York. Clara absorbed this. Then Caldwell is already in contact with Nathaniel's people. What does Caldwell want from this, whatever Nathaniel is offering him? She said. Information about the estate, access to the legal proceedings, possibly a finder's fee or a commission. She stood up from the table. Edwin Caldwell is a careful man. He wouldn't contact Nathaniel unless there was something in it for him. Samuel stood up too. So we have Nathaniel in town, Caldwell feeding him information and a legal petition in Boston. Yes. What does Nathaniel actually need from being here? If it's a legal matter in Boston, why come to Wyoming? Clara looked at him. And in this moment, she was reminded sharply that Samuel Dawson's plain exterior contained a mind that moved clearly and fast when the situation called for it. He needs evidence, she said. He needs to be able to stand in a Boston courtroom and say, I traveled personally to Wyoming Territory, and I witnessed firsthand the conditions in which Miss Whitmore is living and the nature of the marriage she has contracted, and it is my professional assessment that she made a mistake, Samuel finished. That she is incapable of sound judgment, Clara said, which allows him to argue for renewed guardianship over the estate. Samuel was very still for a moment. He wants to be your guardian again, he said. He wants control of $3 million, Clara said. I am merely the obstacle between him and it. The way she said it, the matter-of-fact flatness of it, the complete absence of self-pity, hit Samuel somewhere unexpected. He had known people who talked about their own suffering with drama, using it as currency to purchase sympathy. Clara talked about it the way you'd describe a problem with fencing. This is the damage. This is what needs fixing. This is how we address it. All right, Samuel said. All right. That's what I said. Clara stared at him. Samuel, this is $3 million and a powerful man with lawyers in 4 cities. This is not a fence post situation. I know what it is, he said evenly. I'm asking what the first step is. You've been thinking about this longer than I have. What's the first move? She looked at him for a long moment. Then she picked up her pencil and looked at her list. My lawyer is in Boston, she said. I need to write to him today. He needs to know Pierce is here in person. She wrote. I also need to know exactly what Caldwell told Pierce and when. That means someone who can move in town without drawing attention needs to listen carefully. Thomas, Samuel said immediately. He hears everything. People talk in his store. Does he what he... He's been my friend for 30 years, and he came to warn me about Caldwell without being asked. Samuel moved toward the door, reached for his coat. Yes, he would. Samuel. Her voice stopped him at the door. He turned. She was looking at him with an expression that was not quite anything he could name, something between gratitude and something harder to look at directly. I am sorry that I didn't tell you sooner. You deserve to know. Samuel held her gaze. You were scared, he said. I understand scared. And he went to get his horse. Thomas Reed's reaction when Samuel laid out the full picture in the back room of the supply store 20 minutes later went through several stages rapidly. First, disbelief. Then a long, low whistle. Then a silence that lasted approximately 30 seconds. Then what Samuel recognized as Thomas working himself up to say something he'd been thinking throughout the silence. $3 million, Thomas said. That's not what matters right now. Sam, $3 million. Tom, focus. Thomas put both hands flat on the counter and looked at the ceiling for a moment like he was requesting divine patience. Then he looked back at Samuel. She came here specifically to get away from it, Samuel said. She's not asking for anything except to not have her life taken over again by a man who thinks her money is his money. Thomas's expression shifted. Something in it hardened in the useful, purposeful way that meant he'd moved from shock into action. Caldwell, he said. What do you know? More than I told you before because I didn't know the rest of it before. Thomas moved around the counter and lowered his voice. Pierce arrived Tuesday. By Tuesday evening, he and Caldwell were having dinner at Caldwell's house. Not a public meeting. Private. He paused. My wife's sister works in Caldwell's kitchen. Samuel waited. She heard Pierce tell Caldwell that the woman was sitting on an inheritance large enough to buy the entire Wyoming Territory twice over, and that if Caldwell could provide documentation of the ranch's debts and financial condition, there would be a significant finder's arrangement. Caldwell agreed. My sister-in-law said Caldwell shook the man's hand before the soup course was finished. Thomas's jaw tightened. He's going to pull your loan. Samuel looked at him. Caldwell's going to call in the note on the north grazing land, Thomas said. Soon. To demonstrate that the ranch is financially unstable. To give Pierce the evidence that this marriage was a reckless decision made by a woman who lacks sound judgment. Samuel said nothing for a moment. He thought about the 43 cattle he had, the north field, the fencing, the 2 winters that had already knocked him down hard. He thought about what it would mean to have that note called and the land taken, the ranch reduced even further. And then, unexpectedly, he thought about what Clara had said at the breakfast table their third day, looking at the ledger, her pencil moving, her eyes calculating something he couldn't see yet. This property has problems that have solutions. That is very different from impossible. What's the date on the note? Samuel asked. It rolls over in 12 days. Then we have 12 days, Samuel said. Sam, do you have any idea? What I need is for you to keep listening, Samuel said. Can you do that? Keep track of where Pierce goes, who he talks to, whether Caldwell moves on the note early. Thomas looked at him with the expression of a man who knew he was agreeing to something complicated. Yes, he said. Samuel nodded. He was halfway to the door when Thomas called after him. Sam, for what it's worth. Samuel stopped. What she did coming out here trying to be a regular person, I understand that. Eleanor's family had money. Not like this, but enough. And she told me once that the hardest thing about it was never knowing if people wanted her or wanted the money. Thomas paused. Your wife was trying to find out if somebody could just want her. That's not deception. That's just being afraid of the right thing. Samuel stood at the door with his hand on the frame. I know, he said, for the second time that day. And he rode back to the ranch faster than he'd ridden anywhere in years. He found Clara in this barn, not working, or rather not doing the barn work he might have expected. She was sitting on a bale of hay in the far corner, and she was writing. Fast-focused the way she always wrote when she had something important to say. 3 sheets of paper already filled and set aside. A 4th in progress. Hector was conspicuously absent, which meant she'd sent him somewhere to give herself privacy, which meant she'd been in here long enough to finish the letters first and process her feelings second, which told Samuel something he filed away without comment. He sat down on the bale across from her without announcing himself. She looked up briefly, read his face, and kept writing. Caldwell is calling in the note, Samuel said. I know, Clara said without stopping. He waited. I worked it out on the ride back from town 3 days ago, she said. She set down her pen and picked up the sheets she'd already finished. These are letters to my lawyer to the courthouse in Cheyenne and to 2 people in Boston who owe my father's memory certain courtesies. She set them back down and picked up the pen again. I'm also writing to the land registry office. I want a full copy of every document that touches this property, filed in a location that neither Caldwell nor Pierce can access. Samuel looked at her. You've been working on this for 3 days, he said. Not an accusation. Something closer to wonder. I've been working on this since I read the Boston letter, she said. The man getting off the stagecoach was only the last confirmation I needed. She finished the line she was writing and looked up. I don't panic, Samuel. I plan. It's the only thing I've ever known how to do reliably. What do you need from me? I need you to let me handle the legal end, she said. And I need you to not... She paused, choosing the word carefully. To not diminish yourself in front of Pierce. Whatever he says about this ranch, about you, about the circumstances, don't agree with him. Don't defend yourself in a way that sounds like apology. Samuel frowned slightly. Why would I apologize to him? Because he's going to come here, and he's going to look at you, and he's going to say things that are designed to make you feel small, Clara said. Her voice was very steady. He is exceptionally good at making people feel small. I have watched him do it for 15 years. He'll find the things you're already uncertain about, the debts, the herd size, the struggling years, and he'll say them back to you as if they're evidence of failure. And he'll do it in a tone of polite concern that makes it very hard to push back without looking defensive. She was looking at him with the intensity of someone who needed him to hear this precisely. He will try to make this marriage look like a mistake you made, she said, and I need you to not believe him, because it wasn't. The barn was quiet. Outside, Pete was somewhere working. The sound of a hammer on a fence post, regular and steady, came through faintly. Do you believe it? Samuel asked. That it wasn't a mistake? She didn't look away. I came here to answer that question, she said. And I've had 4 weeks to observe the answer. A pause. No, I don't believe it was a mistake. Samuel nodded once. He stood up. I'm going to talk to Pete about the Northfield lease, he said. If we can get the Harmon brothers to sign an arrangement before Caldwell makes his move, it changes the financial picture. He stopped. And Clara, the note in your pocket, the one from your lawyer, is there anything in there I should know about? Anything you haven't told me? She looked at him for a long moment. There is one thing, she said quietly. He waited. The estate, she said. The properties and holdings. Some of them are land, not in Boston. My father invested in Western land before he died. He believed the territories were the future. She paused. Some of that land is in Wyoming. Samuel felt something shift in the air. How much land? he asked carefully. I don't know exactly. I've only seen the survey records once when I was 18. The lawyers have been managing it. She held his gaze. But Samuel, there is a possibility, a real possibility, that some portion of what is legally mine is land in this county. He was very still. In this county, he repeated. Near Redstone Valley, she said. The silence stretched. That changes what Pierce wants from being here, Samuel said slowly. Yes, Clara said. If he can argue guardianship over the estate, and if there is estate land in this county land that Caldwell would know about through property records, then this isn't just about the money in Boston. She looked at him steadily. It's about what's under our feet, Samuel. It might be about land that borders yours, land that a man with the right legal authority could use to pressure this ranch from two directions at once. Samuel stood in the barn doorway and let that land in his chest. Nathaniel Pierce hadn't come to Wyoming just to collect evidence of Clara's poor judgment. He had come because there was something here worth taking, and he had been in town for 2 days already having dinner with Edwin Caldwell, and Samuel and Clara were only now beginning to understand what they were actually up against. We need to move faster, Samuel said. Yes, Clara said. She had already picked up the pen again. We do. Pete Garland had worked for Samuel for 11 years, which meant he had earned the right to say exactly what he thought. A right he had always used with moderate frequency and increasing candor as his back got worse and his patience for nonsense decreased. He said what he thought when Samuel found him at the north fence line and explained the situation. This is a mess, Pete said. Thank you, Pete. No, I mean a genuine complicated mess, boss. Not the ordinary kind. He leaned on the fence post he'd been examining and squinted. This man Pierce, he dangerous. Legally dangerous, not physically, I don't think. What about Caldwell? Caldwell does what's profitable, Samuel said. Right now, what's profitable is cooperating with Pierce. If that changes, Caldwell will change. So we need to make it unprofitable. Pete chewed on that. The Harmon brothers. You thought about talking to them about the North Quarter. That's why I'm here. Pete was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the north field. Samuel watched him the way Pete's mind worked slower than some but thorough moving through the angles. You know Jacob Harmon owes you from the winter of '82, Pete said finally. When his main water line froze and your cattle were already suffering and you still let him pull from your secondary well for 3 weeks free of charge. I wasn't keeping score, Samuel said. Jacob was, Pete said. I've heard him say so. Man like that doesn't forget a debt. He picked up his hammer. Want me to ride out to the Harmon place this afternoon? No, Samuel said. I want to ride out myself, but not yet. He looked at the fence line. First, I want to know exactly what's on that Northfield survey. Every boundary, every marker. Pete looked at him sideways. Why? Because there might be something on it I didn't know about, Samuel said carefully. Something that makes it more valuable than I thought. Pete was quiet for a moment. Boss, he said slowly. Is there something you're not telling me? Samuel looked at the field. At the grass that was good grass always had been. At the northern boundary markers, old wooden stakes that had been there since his father set them. At the land he'd been working for 20 years without fully considering what it might border, what it connected to, what it might represent to someone who was looking at the whole map instead of just his piece of it. Not yet, he said, but I think I'm about to find out. Nathaniel Pierce came to the ranch on Friday morning. Samuel had expected him to come eventually. He hadn't expected it to be so soon. 3 days after arriving in town, walking up the road to the Dawson property, like a man arriving to assess a business he was considering purchasing. Samuel was in the yard when he heard the horse. He didn't move. He kept doing what he was doing, repairing the latch on the barn door, the same latch he'd been meaning to fix for 2 weeks. He heard the rider come to the gate. He heard the pause when the man took in the property. He heard the horse come forward. He kept working on the latch. "Mr. Dawson," said a voice behind him, smooth, deliberate, the voice of a man who knew his voice was a tool and used it accordingly. Samuel turned around. Up close, Nathaniel Pierce was even more precisely assembled than he'd appeared at the stagecoach. Everything about him was controlled. The posture, the expression, the careful pleasantness on his face that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Pierce," Samuel said. Nathaniel looked around the property. That quick assessing sweep of the eyes. Samuel watched him do it and kept his own face still. "I was hoping to speak with Clara," Nathaniel said. "She's busy," Samuel said. "It's rather important." "She's still busy." A thin smile. "Mr. Dawson, I've come a long way. I only want to ensure that Clara is well and that she understands her current legal situation fully." "She understands it fine," Samuel said. "Better than you'd like, probably." The smile stayed, but something behind it shifted. The faint recalibration of a man who had expected resistance and was deciding how to address it. "She's a remarkable woman," Nathaniel said. "Capable and intelligent. But she has made some impulsive decisions in the past year that have complicated her legal standing considerably." He let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here as an adversary, Mr. Dawson. I'm here as someone who has known Clara since she was a child, someone who cares about her well-being." Samuel looked at him. He thought about Clara in the barn, writing her careful letters. He thought about the word she'd used, diminish. "He will try to make you feel small. He'll find the things you're already uncertain about and say them back as if they're evidence of failure." He understood now what she had meant. Because Nathaniel Pierce was doing it right now without having said a single word about the debts or the herd size or the struggling years. He was doing it with his posture and his clothing and his smooth voice. He was doing it by standing in Samuel's yard and looking at Samuel's property with the eyes of a man who was deciding what it was worth. "She doesn't need your care," Samuel said. "She has me." Nathaniel looked at him for a moment. With respect, Mr. Dawson, a struggling cattle ranch in Wyoming Territory, is not the same as adequate care for a woman of Clara's means and standing. "Nobody asked what you thought," Samuel said. The pleasantness didn't crack. But for just a moment, one brief moment, something cold moved behind Nathaniel Pierce's eyes. Something that looked much more honest than anything else on his face. "I'll be in town for some time," Nathaniel said. "Clara knows where to find me when she's ready to talk." He turned his horse and rode back down the road. Samuel watched him go. He felt the cold settle into his chest, not fear exactly. Something more like the particular clarity that came when the situation stopped being abstract and became real. When the storm on the horizon was no longer a storm on the horizon, but rain hitting the roof above your head. He went inside. Clara was at the table. She had heard everything. The window had been open, and she had not moved. She was very still, both hands flat on the table, looking at nothing in particular. "How much of that did you hear?" Samuel asked. "All of it," she said. He sat down across from her. "He's better in person than I'd prepared you for," she said quietly. "I forgot how—" She stopped. "I'm sorry. I should have warned you more specifically." "You warned me fine," Samuel said. "I just needed to see it for myself." He paused. "Clara, the land, the Wyoming land in the estate. We need to know exactly what we're dealing with. Today." She looked at him. "I have a way to find out," she said. "But it requires going to the county land registry, and it requires doing it before Caldwell knows we're looking." She paused. "If Caldwell is already managing Pierce's access to property records, then we go first thing tomorrow morning," Samuel said, "before Caldwell's bank opens." Clara nodded slowly. Something in her face that controlled careful surface shifted fractionally. Not much, just enough. "Samuel," she said. "Yeah. Why are you doing this?" she asked. And for the first time since she'd arrived in Redstone Valley, her voice had something in it that wasn't controlled. Something that was genuinely carefully asking. "You could walk away from this. Tell a judge this was a misunderstanding. No one would fault you for it." Samuel looked at her across the table. He thought about the morning she'd asked him why he was feeding the wrong pasture. He thought about her sitting at his desk reading 6 years' worth of ledger entries without flinching. He thought about Pete saying she sees things you miss. He thought about 37 years of silence and 6 years of it being the wrong kind, and a woman who had stepped off a stagecoach with one small suitcase and looked at his broken-down ranch and seen something worth working on. "I don't walk away from things that are mine," he said. Clara held his gaze, and something in her face finally quietly fully came undone, not in pieces, but all at once, like a fist unclenching after a very long time. Her eyes went bright at the edges. Her hands on the table relaxed. She did not cry. She was not a woman who cried easily. But she held that look for a moment before she pulled herself back, and in that moment, Samuel saw exactly what it had cost her, all of it. Every careful letter, every controlled expression, every year of fighting alone for what was already hers. "All right," she said finally. Her voice was steady again. "Then let's go find out what we're actually fighting for," she said. And outside the kitchen window, the Wyoming wind pushed hard against the house, and the cottonwood tree on the hill bent in it, and the north field. The field they didn't yet fully understand, stretched out under the gray November sky waiting. They left before dawn. Samuel had the wagon ready by 5 in the morning, the horses already harnessed, a lantern lit against the dark. Clara came out of the house pulling on her coat, her hair pinned back fast, carrying a leather satchel that held every document she'd brought west with her. The originals, the ones her lawyer had spent 2 years assembling, the ones she had never let out of her physical possession since the day she'd packed them in Boston. She climbed up onto the wagon seat without being helped. Samuel noticed that about her, she never waited for assistance she didn't need. It wasn't stubbornness. It was simply that she had learned to count on herself first, and adjust later if someone turned out to be reliable. He was beginning to understand that he was slowly being moved into the reliable category. They rode to town in the dark without talking much. Not uncomfortable silence, the other kind. The kind that had started developing between them in the past week, where neither of them felt the need to fill the air with words just to prove they were present. Samuel had not experienced that kind of silence with another person in 6 years. He had forgotten it existed. The county land registry office was attached to the courthouse on the east end of Redstone Valley's main street. The clerk, a thin, fussy man named Arthur Briggs, arrived to open at 7:30 and found Samuel and Clara already waiting on the steps. Briggs looked at them with the mild alarm of a man whose mornings rarely began with people waiting urgently for land records. "Mr. Dawson," he said carefully, "this is early. We need to look at survey records," Samuel said. "Everything on file for the north half of this county, going back 30 years. Briggs unlocked the door slowly. "That's a significant amount of material." "We have time," Clara said. Briggs looked at her, seemed to reassess something about the morning, and moved faster. Inside, he pulled ledgers and survey maps while Samuel and Clara stood at the long wooden table in the center of the room. Clara opened her satchel and laid her own documents alongside the registry's records, beginning to cross-reference with a focus that made Briggs hover uncertainly near the door, before deciding he had other things to attend to and retreating to his desk. The first hour was methodical. Clara moved through the records the way she moved through ledgers, systematically, without haste, her pencil making small, careful notes on a fresh sheet of paper. Samuel watched her and followed her work, learning the system as she went. At the 50-minute mark, she stopped. She put her pencil down. She looked at the survey map in front of her for a long moment without speaking. "Samuel," she said. He moved to stand beside her and looked at what she was looking at. The map was dated 1868. It showed the northern portion of the county in careful lines, property boundaries, water sources, road paths. Samuel's land was on it, the boundaries he knew by heart, the north field, the east pasture, the creek line along the southern edge, and there adjacent to his northern boundary, marked in a different ink that indicated a later survey edition, a parcel of land. Larger than he'd realized. Much larger. The notation in the margin read, "Whitmore Land Trust." Survey confirmed 1871. R.A. Whitmore proprietor. Clara's father. Samuel read it twice. "How big?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. Clara was already measuring with her fingers against the scale marker at the edge of the map. Her face was very still. "Approximately 900 acres," she said. The room was quiet enough that Samuel could hear the clock on Briggs's desk ticking from across the room. 900 acres. Directly north of his property. Land he had ridden past his entire life without knowing who owned it, assuming it was territorial commons or some distant absent landlord's forgotten holding. Land that had been sitting in a trust for 14 years since Robert Whitmore died. Land that was Clara's. "He bought it in 1868, Clara said quietly. She was reading the margin notes. "The year I was born," she paused. "He wrote to me once I was very young. I barely remember it. He said he was investing in the future. He said the Western Territories were where the next generation would build everything." Her voice stayed level, but something in it had gone careful. "I didn't know he meant literally." "Does Pierce know about this parcel?" Samuel asked. "He knows about the Western land holdings in general. Whether he's identified this specific parcel," she stopped. "The telegrams Caldwell sent. To Boston, Philadelphia, New York. What if he wasn't just sending information? What if he was asking for it? Asking Pierce's lawyers to pull the Western land surveys?" Samuel looked at her. "If Caldwell already has access to the registry," he started. "Mr. Briggs," Clara said, turning toward the clerk's desk. Her voice was pleasant and precise. "Has anyone else requested access to these survey records recently? In the past week?" Briggs looked up from his papers. He had the expression of a man caught between professional discretion and the specific awkwardness of being looked at directly by Clara Whitmore, who had a way of making people feel that evasion was more trouble than honesty. "I'm not sure I'm at liberty." "Mr. Briggs," Samuel said, "has Edwin Caldwell been in here?" A pause. "Yesterday afternoon," Briggs said. "Did he look at survey records for this northern section?" Another pause. Longer. "He did," Briggs said. Clara and Samuel looked at each other. Caldwell had been here yesterday, the day after Pierce arrived, which meant Pierce had already identified the Whitmore land parcel, which meant he hadn't come to Wyoming just to gather evidence about Clara's judgment. He had come because he had found the land. 900 acres adjacent to a cattle ranch whose owner had just married the woman who legally owned it. Samuel felt the full shape of it settle into place. The dinner with Caldwell the first night. The note pushed under the office door. The petition in Boston claiming mismanagement. The plan to call in the note on the north grazing land. It wasn't about embarrassing Clara. It wasn't even primarily about the money in the Boston estate. It was about this land. These 900 acres sitting between Samuel's northern boundary and the open territory beyond. Land that if Nathaniel Pierce could establish guardianship over Clara's estate, he could manage, sell, develop, or leverage any way he chose. Land that if Samuel's ranch failed financially, could potentially be acquired at a fraction of its value by a man who already knew what it was worth. "He's been planning this since before he got on the train," Samuel said. "Yes," Clara said. She was already writing. "He identified the Wyoming holdings before he filed the Boston petition. The petition is designed to create legal pressure. The financial pressure on your ranch is designed to create instability. And then he arrives as the concerned guardian figure," Samuel said, "ready to manage everything including 900 acres of Wyoming Territory. While my husband's struggling ranch conveniently collapses next door," Clara said, "making the combined land available for development at a price no local rancher could afford, but a man with access to a $3 million estate could manage easily." The full picture was ugly in its thoroughness. "We need a lawyer," Samuel said. "Not in Boston, here, Cheyenne," Clara said immediately. "There's a firm in Cheyenne that handles territorial land disputes. My Boston lawyer mentioned them when I told him I was coming west." She was already reaching into her satchel. "I wrote their name down." She found the paper and handed it to him. "I'll ride to Cheyenne today," Samuel said. Clara looked at him. That's a 6-hour ride. Then I'll leave now. Samuel. She stopped. Started again. Be careful. If Pierce realizes we're moving legally, he'll accelerate. He'll push Caldwell to call in the note early, before the 12 days are up. Then we need to move before he realizes, Samuel said. How long will it take you to copy these survey records? Clara was already asking Briggs for paper. An hour, she said. Go. He went. Thomas was at his supply store when Samuel came through the door at a pace that made Thomas's one employee, a young man named Will, step back instinctively. I need to talk to you, Samuel said. Thomas took one look at his face and told Will to watch the counter. In the back room, Samuel laid it out in under 5 minutes. The Whitmore land parcel. The 900 acres. Caldwell at the registry. Pierce's actual plan. Thomas was quiet through all of it. When Samuel finished, Thomas sat down heavily on a supply crate. Lord Almighty, he said. I'm riding to Cheyenne, Samuel said. I need you to watch Clara while I'm gone. And I need you to watch Caldwell. If he makes any move toward calling in that note before I'm back. I'll know within the hour, Thomas said. My brother-in-law does Caldwell's accounting work. Samuel stared at him. You never mentioned that. You never needed it before. Thomas stood up. Go, I'll handle things here. He paused. Sam, Pierce is going to know you've gone to Cheyenne. Small towns talk. Let him know, Samuel said. Let him think about what that means. Thomas nodded slowly. You've changed in the past month, he said. You know that. Samuel was already at the door. I have better company, he said, and he rode hard for Cheyenne. Clara spent the hour after Samuel left doing 3 things simultaneously, in the efficient parallel way her mind had always worked when the pressure was real. She copied the survey records with Briggs's permission, and her own hand not trusting copies made by anyone else, not today. She wrote 2 more letters, one to her Boston lawyer, with the specific details of the Wyoming parcel and instructions to file for immediate injunctive protection of the estate's western holdings, and one to a judge in Boston, whom her lawyer had described as someone who took a dim view of trustees who overstepped. And she talked to Arthur Briggs. She talked to Briggs the way she had learned to talk to people who had information and weren't sure they should share it, not pressuring, not bribing, simply engaging him as a person who had a stake in his own community and might want to understand what was being done in it. By the time she left the registry office, she knew 3 additional things. Caldwell had not just looked at the survey records yesterday. He had requested copies. Official copies with the registry seal the kind admissible in court proceedings. Pierce's lawyer, a man named Greer, who had arrived in Redstone Valley on Wednesday, the day after Pierce, and had been staying quietly at the hotel, had been seen entering Caldwell's bank twice since arriving, and Edwin Caldwell had filed a preliminary notice with the registry 2 days ago. Not the formal call-in of Samuel's note, something earlier in the process, but a step toward it. They were moving faster than the 12 days suggested. Clara walked out of the registry office and stood on the courthouse steps and made herself think clearly for 60 seconds. Just 60 seconds of pure, structured thought before she allowed herself to react. She had faced Nathaniel Pierce in a Boston courtroom for 2 years. She had faced him across conference tables and through lawyers' letters and through a sustained campaign of social and financial pressure that would have broken someone with less practice at being alone in a fight. She had won. She reminded herself of that. She had won. Then she picked up her satchel and walked directly to Thomas Reed's supply store. Thomas was behind the counter when she came in. He looked at her face and said something quick to his employee and came around the counter. Samuel told me, he said. Good, then we don't need to spend time on that. She kept her voice low. Caldwell filed a preliminary notice 2 days ago. His lawyer has been meeting with Pierce's man since Wednesday. We have less time than we thought. Thomas's face went serious in a specific, useful way. How much less? I don't know, but I'm not going to wait to find out. She set her satchel on the counter. You know this town. You know its people. I need to understand something. Is there anyone in Redstone Valley who has reason to be unhappy with Edwin Caldwell? Not personal unhappiness. Financial, business. People he's dealt with in ways they found unfair. Thomas looked at her for a long moment. You're building something, he said. I'm building options, she said. Who? Thomas thought. Ben Hooper. He had a crop loan 5 years ago, and Caldwell called it in during a drought year on technical grounds. Ben lost his East 40 acres. He counted on his fingers. The Marsh family. Caldwell refused a business loan when Marcus Marsh wanted to open a second livery, then 6 months later a cousin of Caldwell's opened one instead. He paused. And there's Judge Whitfield. Clara looked up. There's a judge in Redstone Valley. Retired circuit judge. He moved here 4 years ago. He and Caldwell had a very public disagreement at a town meeting about this is actually relevant, about whether a bank could legally call in a note on improved agricultural land without a 90-day notice period. Clara went very still. Who was right? She asked. Whitfield said the law required 90 days. Caldwell said the note's individual terms superseded the general statute. Thomas paused. They never resolved it. Caldwell called Whitfield an obstructionist. Whitfield called Caldwell a predator in a suit. Town enjoyed the argument for weeks. Where does Judge Whitfield live? Clara asked. 3 streets over, Blue Door. Thomas looked at her steadily. Clara, are you about to go ask a retired judge to help you? I'm about to go have a conversation with a man who understands land law and has strong opinions about banking practices, she said, already moving toward the door. Whether that becomes help depends on the conversation. Thomas watched her go. Lord, he said to no one in particular. Sam had no idea what he was getting when he wrote that letter. He meant it as a compliment. So, Judge Elias Whitfield was 71 years old, sharp-eyed and deeply unhappy about being retired. Clara knew this within the first 4 minutes of their conversation because he answered the door himself. Looked at her with the alert attention of a man who had not had an interesting problem cross his threshold in some time, and when she said, I need to speak with someone who understands territorial land law and the legal limits of trustee authority. He opened the door wider and said, Come in, before she finished the sentence. She was there for 2 hours. She laid out the full case, her father's estate, the trustee arrangement, the Boston lawsuit, the Wyoming land parcel, Pierce's current petition, Caldwell's involvement. She showed him her documents. She showed him the survey records she'd copied. She answered his questions directly and completely, the way she had learned to present information to people who were intelligent enough to know when they were being managed. Whitfield asked excellent questions. This preliminary notice Caldwell filed, he said, looking at the copy she'd obtained. Do you have the original terms of your husband's loan agreement? Samuel has them at the ranch. Get them today. If the note's terms include a standard agricultural improvement clause, and most of the notes Caldwell writes include one, I have seen several, then a preliminary notice without the 90-day statutory period is legally defective. He looked over his glasses at her. It would not prevent him from eventually calling the note, but it would slow him down, and it would give you grounds to challenge any rushed action in territorial court. How do I file that challenge? I can write the motion, Whitfield said. I am retired, not dead, and I am not legally prohibited from preparing documents for a private party. He paused. I want to be clear about something, Mrs. Dawson. I am not doing this because you are wealthy, or because your case is financially significant. I am doing this because Edwin Caldwell has been conducting business in this county in ways that have damaged people who deserved better, and I have been waiting 4 years for a situation where I could do something about it that would actually stick. Clara looked at him. I appreciate your honesty, she said. And I appreciate yours, he said. You haven't once called this situation unfair. You've described it in legal and practical terms the entire time. Life isn't particularly interested in fairness, Clara said. I've found it responds better to strategy. Whitfield looked at her for a moment. Then he almost smiled, the cautious, restrained smile of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by much, but could still recognize something worth noting. "Get me the loan documents," he said, "and come back this afternoon." Clara was out the door in 30 seconds. She rode back to the ranch herself, fast the way Samuel might have, and the way she had not allowed herself to do since arriving in Wyoming, because she had been careful not to draw attention to the things she knew how to do, that an orphan girl with nothing wasn't supposed to know. She wasn't being careful anymore. Pete was in the yard when she rode in. He took one look at her pace and her expression and didn't say anything foolish like, "Are you all right, or can I help?" He just took the horse's bridle and said, "Loan documents. Where does he keep them?" "How did you—" "Thomas sent Hector out 20 minutes ago to say you'd probably be coming for them," Pete said. Desk. Top left drawer. The brown envelope. Clara was already moving toward the house. She found the envelope exactly where Pete said. She opened it at the desk, read through the loan terms, fast found what she was looking for. Standard Agricultural Improvement Clause Section 4. Paragraph B, 90 days. Written notice required for note acceleration on improved agricultural land under active productive use, and felt something in her chest release approximately 1 degree of tension. Whitfield had been right. Caldwell couldn't legally accelerate the note without 90 days' notice. He could threaten, he could file preliminary paperwork, but if he actually called it in now before giving proper notice, he'd be in violation of his own loan terms and territorial statute simultaneously. She copied the relevant section in her careful handwriting, put the original back in the envelope, and was back on the horse in under 15 minutes. She was halfway back to town when she saw Thomas's wagon coming toward her on the road moving fast. She pulled up. He pulled up beside her. His face told her before he spoke. "Pierce called a public meeting," Thomas said. "Tonight, at the church hall." Clara stared at him. On what authority? None. He simply announced it, said he had important information about the Whitmore estate and its effects on the community, and that anyone with property interests in the North County should attend. Thomas looked at her hard. "Sam's not back from Cheyenne yet." "When is the meeting?" 7 o'clock. Clara looked at the horizon. Late afternoon light growing pale. 3 hours. "Does Caldwell know about it?" "Caldwell is the one who announced it," Thomas said. She absorbed that. Pierce and Caldwell working together openly now. No more private dinners, no more quiet telegrams. They had decided that speed and public pressure were more useful than subtlety, which meant they had something, some document, some legal instrument, some piece of the puzzle she hadn't accounted for that made them confident enough to move into the open. "What do they have?" she said, more to herself than to Thomas. "I don't know," Thomas said. "But Clara, half the town will be there tonight. Property owners, ranch families, people who have land in the North County and will listen to whatever Pierce tells them." He paused. "If he stands up in front of them and says that the Whitmore estate claims 900 acres adjacent to their properties, that the estate is being mismanaged, and that the solution is a new trustee with proper authority, some of those people will believe him. Because it sounds like protection," Clara said. "He'll frame it as protecting their interests." "Yes." She thought for approximately 4 seconds. "I need to be at that meeting," she said. Thomas looked alarmed. "Clara without Sam. Samuel isn't here," she said. "Not sharp, just factual. Which means I handle this myself, which is what I've been doing for most of my life, so I'm not overly concerned." She gathered her reins. "Go back to town. Tell Judge Whitfield I'll be at his house in 20 minutes with the loan documents. And Thomas, send word to the Harmon brothers. Tell them Samuel wants to discuss that land lease arrangement and ask if they can come to town tonight, before 7. Thomas stared at her. "You're going to walk into that meeting with the Harmon brothers at your side," he said. "I'm going to walk into that meeting with everything I need," she said. "The Harmons are just part of it." She rode past him before he could respond. What Clara did in these 2 hours between that conversation and 7 o'clock that evening was something Redstone Valley would discuss for a long time afterward, mostly because nobody fully understood how she did it so fast. She went to Whitfield. He reviewed the loan document, confirmed the clause violation, and drafted a formal legal challenge in under 40 minutes with the focused efficiency of a retired judge who had been waiting for exactly this. She went to the Harmon brothers Jacob and Martin, both of them large, sun-weathered men in their 50s who listened to her explain the lease arrangement for the North Field with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had expected to discuss cattle pricing and were instead getting a complete financial proposition with projected revenue figures. Jacob Harmon, who had not forgotten the winter of 1882, and Samuel's water well, signed the preliminary agreement with a pen Clara produced from her satchel before Martin had finished reading it. She went to Ben Hooper, whose 40 acres Caldwell had taken 5 years ago, and explained what she knew about Caldwell's current practices. She did not ask him to do anything specific. She simply told him the truth and let him decide what to do with it. Ben Hooper made his own decision in about 90 seconds. She went back to Thomas's store, wrote one more letter to the territorial governor's land office with a formal complaint about irregular registry access and potential conflicts of interest, and asked Thomas to have it telegraphed immediately. And then she went home, changed out of her riding clothes, washed her face, put on the dark dress she'd worn on the stagecoach the day she arrived, and went to the church hall. She was early. The hall was already filling up when she arrived. She saw the faces she expected: ranch families, shop owners, property holders, people whose lives were connected to the land in one way or another. She saw Caldwell near the front, speaking quietly with Pierce's lawyer, Greer. She saw Pierce himself standing to the side with the contained, prepared look of a man who had done this before and expected it to go a particular way. She saw the moment Pierce noticed her. Something moved through his expression. Not surprise he'd known she was in town, but something sharper than he'd expected from a woman he'd underestimated for 15 years. She saw him reassess. She saw him decide it didn't change anything. He was wrong. Clara found a seat 3 rows from the front between Jacob Harmon and a woman named Grace Hooper, whose husband Ben was on her other side. She set her satchel on her lap and folded her hands on top of it and waited. Pierce stood at the front of the hall, and he was as good as Clara had warned Samuel he would be. He was warm. He was concerned. He was carefully, thoroughly reasonable. He talked about the Whitmore estate in terms of community responsibility. He talked about the 900 acres, yes, he named them, laid them out clearly on a hand-drawn map his lawyer held up, and he framed them not as something he wanted to take, but as something the community deserved to have managed properly. This land has sat idle for 14 years, he said, unimproved, producing nothing. Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Dawson as she prefers, has a legal and moral responsibility to the estate that requires professional management. I am here simply to ensure that responsibility is met. He was good. Clara waited. He built his case carefully over 20 minutes. The Boston petition. The petition's grounds. The argument that Clara's departure west, her rushed marriage, her distance from legal advisors, all constituted evidence of he used the word impulsivity with practiced gentleness that raised questions about her capacity to manage an estate of this magnitude. He was very good. I understand, he said, with the warmth of a man performing compassion. He didn't feel that Mrs. Dawson has formed an attachment here, to this community, to her husband. Those attachments are understandable and even admirable. But feelings do not constitute financial management, and the estate requires... Mr. Pierce. Her voice was not loud. She did not stand up. She simply spoke clearly from her seat. The hall went quiet. Pierce looked at her. The estate, Clara said, is not your concern. Mrs. Dawson, I have here, she said, opening her satchel, a legal challenge to Edwin Caldwell's preliminary loan notice prepared this afternoon by Judge Elias Whitfield and citing the 90-day statutory requirement for note acceleration on improved agricultural land. She set the document on the bench beside her. I also have a signed preliminary agreement between my husband's ranch and the Harmon brothers for the lease of our Northfield grazing rights, which resolves the financial question you and Mr. Caldwell have been working to amplify. She set that beside the first. And I have a formal complaint filed this afternoon with the Territorial Governor's Land Office regarding irregular access to county survey records and potential conflict of interest between a local bank officer and an out-of-state trustee. The hall was completely silent. Caldwell's face had gone very still. Pierce's had not changed. He was too practiced for that, but something in his posture had shifted. A fraction. A recalibration. "I came to Wyoming," Clara said, "because I wanted a life. Not an inheritance, not a trust arrangement. A life." Her voice was steady, and she looked at Pierce directly the way she had learned to look at him, not with anger, which was what he wanted, but with something that was considerably more difficult to dismiss. "You have spent 15 years treating me as an asset to be managed. You have filed petitions and hired lawyers, and traveled across the country, and enlisted the help of a local banker, all to prevent a 24-year-old woman from making her own choices about her own life." She paused. "I want the people in this room to understand something clearly. What Mr. Pierce is describing as professional management of an estate is not that. It is an attempt by a man who has already been found by a Boston court to have acted in ways contrary to my interests, to reinstate his authority over money that is not his." Pierce moved to respond. Clara didn't stop speaking. "The 900 acres he showed you on that map," she said. "My father bought that land in 1868, the year I was born. He wrote to me once and said he was investing in the future. He meant me. That land was bought for me, and I intend to be the one who decides what becomes of it." The silence held. Then Ben Hooper from her left said in a voice that carried, "What exactly did that Boston court decide about you, Mr. Pierce?" Pierce looked at him. "That's a private legal matter." "You just stood up here and told us about Mrs. Dawson's private legal matters," Ben Hooper said. "Seems like yours are relevant too." A murmur went through the hall. Jacob Harmon on Clara's right said nothing. He simply sat there like a large, deliberate wall between her and anything that might try to reach her from the right side, which was more useful than anything he could have said. Pierce looked at Clara. She looked back. For the first time in 15 years of looking at Nathaniel Pierce across various tables and courtrooms and legal proceedings, she saw something in his face she had never seen before. Uncertainty. Not defeat, not yet. Pierce was not a man who accepted defeat in a single evening. But the plan he had walked into this hall with had just been interrupted by a woman who had spent the afternoon doing in 2 hours what his team had spent 2 weeks preparing for. He was reassessing, and he knew she could see him doing it. "This isn't over, Clara," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been all evening. Quieter and more honest, which somehow made it more threatening. "I know," she said, "but it is over for tonight." She closed her satchel. The room began to move around them. People talking, shifting the buzz of a community that had just watched something unexpected happen in their church hall and was still working out what it meant. Clara sat still in the middle of it, and she was aware of something she hadn't been fully aware of since she arrived in Wyoming. The people around her were not neutral. Ben Hooper was talking to someone near the back. Jacob Harmon was answering questions from 2 ranchers who had moved toward him. Thomas Reed had materialized from somewhere near the door and was performing the specific function he was very good at, which was talking to everyone and ensuring the version of events that traveled through the room was the accurate one. These people were not hers. She had been here 4 weeks. But they were not Pierce's either. And in the quiet, specific arithmetic of a small frontier town that mattered. She was still sitting there when the hall had mostly emptied, and Thomas came to stand in the row in front of her, turned to face her, and said, "There's a horse outside." She looked at him. "Sam's horse," Thomas said. She was on her feet before he finished the sentence. Samuel was at the back of the hall, still in his riding coat. Trail dust on him, the particular controlled exhaustion of a man who had ridden 12 hours and was running on something more fundamental than rest. He was talking to a man Clara didn't recognize, well-dressed, in the practical, non-decorative way of a working professional carrying a leather case. The Cheyenne lawyer. Samuel looked up when she came through the back door, and something in his face shifted in the specific way she had started to recognize, not relief, exactly, not surprise. Something more like the expression of a person who had been holding their breath without knowing it, and was now finally not. "You're all right," he said. "I'm fine," she said. "Are you?" "I've been better." He looked at her carefully. "What happened in there I could hear from outside." "We'll need the Cheyenne lawyer," she said. "But not tonight, the way you thought we would." She looked at the man with the leather case. "How good are you at injunctive filings?" The lawyer blinked. "Quite good." "Then come back tomorrow morning with everything you have on trustee authority limits and estate land claims in the Wyoming Territory." She looked at Samuel. "Tonight, I need you to read this." She pulled the Whitfield document from her satchel and handed it to him. "And then I need you to tell me everything about that lease arrangement the Harmons just signed." Samuel took the document. He looked at her. "You've been busy," he said. "You were gone 6 hours," she said. "I don't waste time." He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen twice before, the one that suggested a full smile existed somewhere underneath the controlled surface of Samuel Dawson and was simply waiting for the right moment. "No," he said. "You don't." Outside the church hall, Nathaniel Pierce walked back to his hotel in the dark, and he was not the same man who had walked into that meeting 90 minutes ago. He was still dangerous. He still had lawyers and money and a legal petition in Boston and plans that didn't stop because one evening went wrong. But something had shifted. He had come to Wyoming expecting to find a woman who had run away from her problems. He had found one who had been solving them since before he got off the train. That required a different approach, and in his hotel room by lamplight, he began to think about what that approach would be. What leverage remained? What angles hadn't been tried? What a man did when the position he'd assumed was secure turned out to have a woman standing in the middle of it who was considerably more prepared than he'd accounted for. He thought about the one thing he had that she didn't know about yet. The one document his lawyers had found last week in the Boston records. The thing that could change everything. He poured himself a drink. He would not be rushed. That was always his strength. He could wait longer than people expected, absorb setbacks that would stop other men and come back from a position of apparent weakness, with something that made everything before it irrelevant. He had done it before. He would do it again. And tomorrow, when the dust from this evening settled, he would show Clara Whitmore exactly why he had really come to Wyoming. Samuel didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table with the Whitfield document. The loan agreement, the survey copies, and the notes from the Cheyenne lawyer spread out in front of him, and he read through everything twice slowly, the way he read things that mattered, not for speed, but for understanding. Clara sat across from him and answered his questions as they came, and they worked through it together, the way they had worked through the ranch ledger that first week, except now the stakes were not $40 owed to a feed supplier. The Cheyenne lawyer's name was Richard Hale. He was 40 years old, practiced specifically in territorial land law, and had been recommended to Samuel by a judge in Cheyenne, who said Hale was the man you wanted when the other side had more money and you needed someone who knew the law better than they did. In the 2 hours they'd spent riding back together from Cheyenne, Samuel had formed the opinion that Hale was exactly what the judge described, methodical, unimpressed by wealth, and deeply personally offended by legal manipulation, which Samuel considered a useful quality in a lawyer. Hale had gone to the hotel when they arrived in town. He would come to the ranch in the morning. But tonight, it was just Samuel and Clara and the papers. "Walk me through the Boston petition," Samuel said. "Not the legal language, the plain version." Clara set down her coffee. "Pierce is arguing 3 things. First, that my departure from Boston constitutes abandonment of my fiduciary duty to the estate. Second, that my marriage entered quickly to a man of limited financial means without consulting legal counsel demonstrates impaired judgment. Third, that the estate, particularly the western land holdings, is being actively endangered by my absence from proper management." She paused. "He's asking the court to appoint a temporary trustee until my capacity can be formally evaluated. And that trustee would be him." He suggested himself as the logical choice given his familiarity with the estate. Samuel looked at the papers. "What's the actual legal standard for removing someone's control of their own inheritance?" "It's high," Clara said. "In theory, The court has to find clear evidence of incapacity or active mismanagement causing demonstrable harm. She looked at her hands. In practice, a well-funded legal team with access to sympathetic judges and a narrative about an impulsive young woman who fled east for a frontier marriage can make that standard feel lower than it is. So he needs the narrative to hold, Samuel said. He needs the narrative and he needs evidence, which is why the ranch's financial situation was so useful to him. A note in default, a struggling operation, a wife who arrived with secret wealth. It looks like exactly what he wants it to look like. But the note isn't in default, Samuel said. And now we have the Harmon lease, which changes the financial picture significantly. Yes. Clara nodded. Whitfield's challenge to Caldwell's preliminary notice slows that front. The Harmon agreement demonstrates the ranch is actively managing its obligations. She paused. That takes away 2 of his 3 legs. Samuel looked at her. What's the third leg? Clara was quiet for a moment. I don't know, she said, and that's what concerns me. She looked at the papers between them. He said tonight that this wasn't over. He wasn't performing when he said it. He was telling me something true. Her voice was careful. Pierce doesn't make threats he can't back up. He's not an emotional man. If he said it with that particular flatness, it's because he has something he hasn't played yet. The document, Samuel said. She looked at him sharply. You mentioned in town you said he'd found something in the Boston records last week. He paused. You said that quietly, almost to yourself, right after the meeting ended. Clara stared at him. You heard that? I hear most things, he said. She was quiet for a moment. My lawyer mentioned in his last letter that Pierce's team had been pulling records from the original estate filing. Very old records. From when my father first structured the trust. She folded her hands. I don't know what they found. I've been trying not to assume the worst. What's the worst? Samuel asked. She looked at the table. My father was not a careless man, but he was a fast-moving one. He built a company in 15 years that most men couldn't build in 40. Men who build that fast sometimes cut corners in the documentation. Not illegally, but not perfectly. She paused. If there is any ambiguity in the original trust language, any clause that Pierce's lawyers can interpret as giving the trustee broader authority, then I've been acknowledging that could be the third leg. Samuel absorbed this. Then we need to know what's in those original documents, he said. My lawyer has copies, but he's in Boston. Can he telegraph the relevant sections? Clara thought. The telegraph office here can handle lengthy messages. Gus Merritt runs the office. He's handled everything from cattle contracts to military dispatches. If you pay him enough, he'll sit there all night. Clara stood up. How late does he stay open? For enough money as late as you need. She was already reaching for her coat. Samuel stood up too. I'll come with you, he said. You've ridden 12 hours. I've ridden more on worse reasons. He picked up his own coat. And I'm not sending you into town at 11 at night alone while Nathaniel Pierce is sitting in a hotel 2 streets over. She looked at him. And for just a moment, one brief, unguarded moment, something crossed her face that she didn't have time to arrange into the controlled expression she usually presented. Something that was tired and grateful, and something else he didn't have a name for yet. Thank you, she said. It was a plain word. She said it plainly. But the plainness of it coming from Clara meant more than an elaborate expression would have from most people. Don't thank me yet, he said. Let's see what the telegram says. Gus Merritt was as advertised persuadable by sufficient compensation. He sat at his telegraph machine at 11:45 at night and sent Clara's message to her Boston lawyer, who, given the time difference, would receive it in the early morning hours. Clara wrote the message herself, in the compressed, precise language of someone who understood that telegraph billing was, per word, urgent. Need original trust, language sections 3 through 7, and any codicils your office holds. Also, any documentation of asset surveys filed by Pierce or his agents in past 90 days. Wire complete text, regardless of length, will cover all costs. Then they waited. The lawyer's office would open at 8 Boston time. That was 5 in the morning Wyoming time. which meant sitting in Gus Merritt's small office for 5 hours, which they did Samuel in the wooden chair by the window, Clara at the small table, both of them with coffee that Gus's wife brought over from 2 houses down, because she was that kind of woman, and the night settled around them with the specific quality of waiting that is its own kind of work. They talked, not about the case, about other things, the way people talk when they are waiting together and have exhausted the immediate subject and are starting without planning to learn each other. Clara told him about Boston in winter, the weight of the cold there, the gray light that lasted for months, the way the city felt like being inside a machine that never stopped. Samuel told her about Wyoming winters, which were brutal in completely different ways. The isolation, the sense of the land contracting around you, the particular relief of spring that you never fully appreciated until you'd survived enough of them. He told her about Margaret, not everything, not the grief which was still private, but the person who she had been, how she had laughed, what she had loved about this land. He hadn't talked about Margaret to anyone in years. He didn't fully understand why he was doing it now, except that Clara listened the way she did everything completely without performing empathy. She didn't feel without rushing him through it. When he finished, she said, "She sounds like someone who deserved more time." "She did," he said. "I'm sorry you lost her." "So am I." He looked at the window. "But you play the hand you're dealt." Clara looked at her coffee cup. "My father used to say something similar. He said the cards don't care about the player. The player decides what the cards mean." Samuel looked at her. Smart man. He was. A pause. "I miss him in the specific way you miss people who taught you important things before you were old enough to understand they were teaching you." She paused. "I didn't understand until I was about 16 that the reason he made me read his business correspondence and attend his meetings was not because he needed my help. It was because he was preparing me." "For what happened after he died," Samuel said. "For exactly what happened after he died." She looked at the table. "I used to be angry that he didn't tell me. That he didn't just sit down and say, 'When I'm gone it's going to be difficult and this is how to handle it.' I've stopped being angry about it." A pause. "He knew I'd figure it out. That was his way of saying he believed in me." Samuel looked at her for a moment. "He was right," Samuel said. She looked up. "You figured it out," he said. Simply, without decoration. She held his gaze for a long moment. And then she said quietly, "So did you. This ranch, 6 years alone, everything that went wrong. You kept it." "Barely." "Barely counts," she said. "I know. I've spent most of my life operating on barely, and it turned out to be enough." The clock on Gus's wall moved toward 2 in the morning. Outside Redstone Valley was entirely quiet. Somewhere across town, Nathaniel Pierce was in a hotel room with whatever document he hadn't shown yet. Caldwell was in his house recalculating. Judge Whitfield's motion was sitting ready. Richard Hale was in his hotel room and would arrive at the ranch at 8. And here in a telegraph office, 2 people who had started as strangers in a practical arrangement were becoming something that neither of them had quite planned for, and both of them were cautiously starting to recognize. At 5:12 in the morning, the telegraph machine began to click. Bug. Gus Merritt transcribed. The message was long. Clara had told her lawyer regardless of length, and she had meant it, and her lawyer, a methodical man named Gerald Fitch, who had been handling the Whitmore estate for 11 years and was not given to drama, had sent everything. The original trust language sections 3 through 7, 3 codicils, and a single additional paragraph that he had appended at the end, prefaced with the words, "Mrs. Dawson. Regarding the Pierce asset surveys, I must inform you of the following." Clara read the transcript standing up. She read it once, then she read it again. Samuel watched her face. He had learned in 5 weeks to read Clara's controlled expressions the way you learn to read weather in a place where the sky didn't telegraph its intentions. Obviously, you looked for small signs, specific small signs, and you trusted what they told you even when the surface appeared calm. Her face was calm, but her hands holding the telegram transcript had stopped moving entirely. and her breathing, which was always even, had changed by a degree that only someone watching carefully would notice. "What is it?" Samuel said. She looked up at him. "Pierce didn't find a problem with the trust language," she said. "That's good. His surveyors filed a competing land claim on the Wyoming parcel," she said, 3 weeks ago. "Before he arrived here." She paused. "He filed it in the name of a holding company. A company that his lawyers structured specifically to make the beneficial ownership difficult to trace." Samuel was very still. "He tried to claim your land before he even got here," he said. "He filed a competing claim alleging that the Whitmore Land Trust is in constructive abandonment, that the land has been unmanaged for more than 10 years, and is therefore subject to adverse claim." She set the telegram on Gus's table. "Under territorial law, if a piece of land has been demonstrably unmanaged for 10 consecutive years, and a claimant files for adverse possession, and meets the statutory requirements, the claim has legal standing." "Does his claim meet the requirements?" "That's what his team will argue," Clara said. "They'll say the land was abandoned because I never managed it, never improved it, never even acknowledged it properly. They'll say the trust itself is in constructive abandonment because the trustee Pierce was legally removed from authority over it before proper transfer of management occurred." She paused. "And they'll do it in Wyoming Territorial Court, not Boston, here." Samuel understood what that meant. Here, Pierce had Caldwell. Here, Pierce had whatever relationships he'd spent the past week building. Here, the judge would be a territorial judge, not a Boston federal court, and 900 acres of Wyoming land were the kind of thing a well-funded Eastern operator could move on quickly if the local conditions were favorable. "He split the fight," Samuel said. "Boston was always a distraction. This is where the real battle is." "He needed me focused on the petition," Clara said. Her voice was flat in the specific way it went when she was processing something that was both unexpected and, in retrospect, entirely consistent with what she knew about the man. "He needed me spending time and money and energy on the Boston proceeding, so that by the time I understood what was happening in Wyoming, his claim would be further along." "When did your lawyer find out about the competing claim?" "Yesterday morning Boston time, which is why the telegram came with that paragraph at the end. Gerald doesn't add paragraphs like that unless he's genuinely alarmed." She looked at the transcript. "He says Pierce's Wyoming filing is aggressive, but not without vulnerabilities. If we can demonstrate active management of the land improvement productive use, any evidence of ongoing stewardship, the adverse possession argument weakens significantly." Samuel looked at her. "The North Field," he said. Clara looked at him. "The 900 acres north of my boundary," he said slowly. "Clara, I've been grazing cattle on that land for 4 years." She stared at him. "Not knowing it was yours," he said. "The boundary markers were old, and the land appeared to be commons. I've had cattle on the north sections every summer for the past 4 years. I've maintained the creek crossing on that boundary. I fixed a washout on what I now understand is the southern edge of your father's parcel 2 summers ago." Clara's expression had changed completely. "You've been actively using that land," she said. "Without knowing it, but yes." "Samuel." She picked up the telegram again. "Active use by an agent of the landowner, or by someone operating in good faith on land contiguous to established property, can constitute evidence of management under territorial law." She looked at him. "You married me. What you've done on that land can be argued as done on my behalf." "Is that true legally?" "I'm going to need Hale to confirm it," she said. "But yes, I believe it is." She set the telegram down. "Do you have records of the grazing, the creek crossing repair, the washout work?" "Pete keeps a work log," Samuel said. "Every repair, every maintenance job, every pasture rotation. He's been doing it for 15 years, old habit." "Pete's work log," Clara said, "may be the most important document in Wyoming Territory right now." They looked at each other across Gus Merritt's telegraph desk at 5:30 in the morning, both of them tired in the deep bone way that went past ordinary exhaustion into something that was almost clarifying. And Clara felt something she hadn't felt in the middle of a fight with Nathaniel Pierce in 15 years of fighting him. She felt like she was going to win, Not because the odds were clearly in her favor. They weren't yet. But because, for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone in the particular way she had always been alone. Strategically, competently, effectively alone. But alone in the way that made every victory feel partial because there was no one to share it with. She wasn't alone now. She had a retired judge and a Cheyenne lawyer and 2 Harmon brothers and Ben Hooper, who was angry at Caldwell for entirely legitimate reasons. She had Thomas Reed, who heard everything in this town. She had Hector and Pete's 15 years of careful record-keeping. And she had Samuel, who had ridden 12 hours and sat in a telegraph office all night and was currently looking at her with the steady, undemonstrative concern of a man who had decided she was worth standing beside and had not once since making that decision given any indication of reconsidering it. "We need to go home," she said. "Hale arrives at 8. "It's 5:30, Samuel said. "We have 2 hours. "I know, Clara." His voice was quiet. "When this is over, when Pierce is dealt with and the legal situation is resolved, what do you want?" She looked at him. It was an unexpected question. Not the timing or the practical circumstances, but the question itself. Not what do you need or what's the next step, but what do you want? She couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her that. "I want to stay," she said. Simply, without qualification. Something in Samuel's face moved. "Good," he said. Just that. Good. They rode home in the early morning dark, and somewhere behind them, Nathaniel Pierce was in his hotel room and didn't yet know that a cattle rancher's 15-year maintenance log was about to become the instrument of his defeat. Richard Hale arrived at 7:58. Samuel had slept for 90 minutes and felt approximately human again. Clara had not slept at all and showed no signs of intending to. She had Pete's work log open on the table cross-referenced with her own survey copies, and when Hale walked in, she handed him the telegram transcript and the work log simultaneously and said, "Read these in order without preamble." Hale read them in order. When he finished, he looked up. "The grazing records go back 4 years. To this specific section of the North Land," Samuel said. "Pete logs by pasture name. I renamed the sections 3 years ago, and the log reflects the new names. But the old names correspond to what we now know is the Whitmore parcel's southern portion. And the creek crossing repair. June of 1883. 2 days of work. Pete logged it." Hale set the document as down and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Clara recognized the expression, a lawyer assembling an argument, testing it internally for weak points before committing to it. "The adverse possession claim requires abandonment," Hale said. "Demonstrable, uncontested abandonment for the statutory period. Any evidence of management by the landowner or by an authorized party breaks the abandonment chain." He looked at them. "Your grazing records demonstrate consistent productive use of that land by a party who since November of this year has had legal status as the landowner's spouse." He paused. "I can argue that the management requirement is satisfied." "Will it hold?" Clara asked. "It will hold long enough to challenge Pierce's filing and force a full hearing," Hale said. "At a full hearing with these records, I like our position considerably." "What do we need to do today?" Samuel said. "File a response to the adverse possession claim with the Territorial Land Office," Hale said. "Today, before Pierce's team has the opportunity to advance the filing." He looked at Clara. "I also want to file a motion to consolidate the Wyoming proceedings with a request for federal court oversight, given the interstate nature of the estate. That takes it out of the local territorial court where Pierce has had a week to build relationships." "Can you do that?" Clara asked. "I can do it by noon," Hale said. "If you give me 2 hours to draft." Samuel looked at Clara. Clara looked at Samuel. "The kitchen table is yours," Clara said to Hale. She stood up. "Samuel and I need to go into town." Hale was already opening his leather case. They found Caldwell at his bank at 9 in the morning. Samuel had been inside Caldwell's bank perhaps a dozen times in the years he'd been doing business there. It was a precise, controlled space. Like Caldwell himself, everything in the right place. Nothing unnecessary. the specific atmosphere of a room designed to make the person across the desk feel like the petitioner and Caldwell feel like the authority. Samuel had always cooperated with that atmosphere before. He didn't cooperate with it today. He and Clara sat down across from Caldwell without waiting to be invited to, and Samuel set Pete's work log on the desk, and Clara set the telegram transcript beside it, and they both looked at Caldwell without saying anything for a moment. Caldwell looked at the documents, then at them. Something moved behind his careful eyes. "Mr. Dawson," he said. "Mrs. Dawson, your preliminary notice is legally defective," Clara said. "It violates the 90-day statutory requirement. Judge Whitfield has prepared a formal challenge. If you advance the notice, you'll be in violation of both your own loan terms and territorial statute, and the resulting legal challenge will draw attention to your business practices in ways I don't think you'll find comfortable." Caldwell was quiet. Additionally, Samuel said, "We've signed a preliminary lease agreement with the Harmon brothers for the North Field. The ranch's financial position is no longer what it was when you filed that notice." Caldwell looked at the log and the transcript again. "What is that?" "Evidence," Clara said, "that the Wyoming land Pierce has been telling you is available for adverse possession has been under active management for 4 years, which destroys his claim and makes everyone who assisted that claim potentially liable for filing a fraudulent land petition with the territorial office." The word fraudulent landed in the room with the weight she'd intended. Caldwell was a careful man, a calculating man. He had been calculating since the moment Pierce sat down at his dinner table, and what he had calculated was that Pierce was a winning position. Safe, profitable, and managed by someone with more resources and legal sophistication than anyone local could counter. Clara watched him recalculate in real time. "I received certain representations from Mr. Pierce," Caldwell said slowly, "about the legal status of the estate. Representations," Clara said, "that were incomplete at best and deliberately misleading at worst." She kept her voice level. "Mr. Caldwell, you have been operating this bank in this town for 18 years. That is worth something, considerably more than whatever arrangement you've made with Nathaniel Pierce." She paused. "Withdraw the preliminary notice. Formally distance yourself from Pierce's land filing, and we will not include your involvement in our complaint to the territorial governor's office." Silence. Caldwell looked at Samuel. Samuel looked back at him steadily and didn't say anything because he had learned watching Clara operate that sometimes the most effective thing you could do after the important thing was said was simply to not fill the space. "The preliminary notice," Caldwell said carefully, "was filed prematurely. I will withdraw it on review." "Today," Clara said. "Today," Caldwell agreed. They were back outside in the street in under 12 minutes. Samuel looked sideways at Clara. "That was fast." "He was never committed to Pierce," she said. "He was committed to what he thought Pierce could deliver. When the delivery looks doubtful, men like Caldwell recalculate." She kept walking. "He'll tell Pierce within the hour, which gives us approximately that long before Pierce makes his next move." "What is his next move?" "I don't know yet," she said. "But we'll find out." They found out at noon. Thomas came to the ranch at a pace that told Samuel something had happened before Thomas opened his mouth. "Pierce sent a telegram this morning," Thomas said, "to Boston, to his lawyers." He was slightly out of breath. "Will at the telegraph office." "He read it," Samuel said. "I'm not saying that. I'm saying he remembers what he sends and sometimes mentions it to his wife, who mentions it to Eleanor." Thomas pulled himself together. Pierce wired his lawyers to file an emergency motion in Boston court today, requesting immediate temporary guardianship on the basis of new evidence. Clara went very still. "What new evidence?" Thomas looked at her with an expression that was sorry before he said the words. "He claims to have documentation that your marriage is not legally valid," Thomas said. The kitchen went completely quiet. Samuel looked at Clara. Clara's face had done something he'd never seen it do before, not fallen exactly, but paused, like a clock that has missed a beat. "What documentation?" Her voice was careful, controlled. But underneath it something was different. His telegram said he has a prior betrothal agreement. Thomas said quietly. Signed. Dated 3 years ago. Between you and a man named... He looked at the note in his hand. Edward Hargrove of Philadelphia. Samuel turned and looked at Clara. Clara was looking at the table. The silence lasted 5 seconds. To Samuel, it felt considerably longer. Clara, he said. Quietly. She looked up at him, and her face, the composed, contained, strategically controlled face of a woman who had spent 15 years never letting anyone see her be uncertain, was not composed. It wasn't a real betrothal, she said. It was a business arrangement. My lawyers and his lawyers and Pierce's lawyers structured it as part of the estate negotiation 3 years ago. I signed a preliminary agreement contingent on 12 conditions, all of which were never met. The agreement has no legal standing. But it exists, Samuel said. It exists on paper, yes. And Pierce has it. She held his gaze. I should have told you. I know I should have told you. I didn't because it felt like one more thing, one more piece of the past I was trying to be free of, and She stopped, pulled herself back, started again. I made a mistake. I didn't tell you everything, and that was wrong, and I'm sorry. Samuel looked at her for a long moment. Hale appeared in the kitchen doorway, having heard enough from the next room. How contingent, he said. Clara turned to him. 12 conditions. Formal presentation to the Hargrove family. A 60-day negotiation period. A separate property agreement. Financial disclosures from both parties. Joint legal review. She paused. None of them occurred. The 60-day period expired without any action. My lawyer has correspondence confirming the agreement lapsed. Hale nodded slowly. Then the document Pierce has is an expired preliminary agreement with no legal standing, but it's a document with my signature on it dated 3 years ago, agreeing to marry someone else, Clara said. And Pierce is going to argue that it was still operative when I entered into this marriage, which would make this marriage potentially voidable, Hale said. Not void, voidable. There's a difference. But yes, a hostile judge in Boston could use it to support a finding that the marriage was entered into under circumstances that raise questions. Which is all he needs, Clara said. He doesn't need to actually void the marriage. He just needs a judge to take the question seriously enough to appoint a temporary trustee while it's investigated. Thomas was looking between them. So what do we do? Samuel had been quiet through this entire exchange. He had listened to all of it. The expired agreement, the Philadelphia name, the document that existed, and the 12 conditions that didn't, the legal technicality that Pierce was trying to turn into a weapon. He thought about the first letter Clara had written him. Your letter was the most honest one I have received. He thought about the kitchen table and the ledger and Pete's fence post question, and the night in the telegraph office, and I want to stay said simply without qualification. He thought about 6 years of silence in this house, and what had been in this house for the past 5 weeks. Clara, he said. She turned to look at him. Do you want to be married to me? He asked. She stared at him. It was such a direct question, so bare of strategy or maneuvering or legal positioning. It was the question underneath all the documents and telegrams and injunctions and claims, the one that none of them had said out loud. Yes, she said, without hesitating, without qualifying. Then that's the answer, he said. He looked at Hale. What does she need to file to make the Boston court understand that this marriage is not voidable? Hale thought for a moment. An affidavit from both of you, signed notarized, stating the circumstances of the marriage and the nature of the relationship, accompanied by corroborating testimony from witnesses who can attest to the authenticity of the relationship. Thomas, Samuel said. I'll sign whatever you need, Thomas said immediately. Whitfield, Clara said. He's a retired judge. His affidavit carries weight. Jacob Harmon, Samuel said. He knows me. He's known me for 20 years. And Eleanor, Thomas added. My wife saw Clara arrive. She's been watching this unfance since day one. She will not be shy about what she's observed. Something was shifting in the room. The weight of the problem was still there. Pierce in his hotel, the Boston court, the expired agreement on paper, but the weight had a different quality now. It was a weight they were carrying together, which was not the same as a weight one person carries alone. Clara looked around the kitchen. At Hale, with his leather case. At Thomas, who had ridden out here because that was simply what Thomas did. At Samuel, across the table. "Write the affidavits," she said to Hale. "All of them." She looked at Samuel. "And I need to tell you something else." He waited. "The 12 conditions on the Hargrove agreement," she said. "One of them was a financial disclosure. I was required to disclose the full value of the estate, including the western land holdings." She paused. "I refused. That was the condition that officially killed the agreement. Hargrove's family withdrew when I refused disclosure." She paused again. "I refused because I had already decided I didn't want the marriage. But the reason I gave my lawyers was that I didn't trust them with the information." "So you've been protecting this land for 3 years," Samuel said slowly. "Without knowing why," she said. "Without knowing there was a ranch on the other side of the boundary. Without knowing any of this." She looked at him. "But yes, I held that line. I always held that line." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Your father taught you well," he said. Her face did the thing it did that brief, real, uncontrolled moment, and she looked away before it could be more than a moment. "Hale," Samuel said, standing up. "How fast can you draft the affidavits?" 2 hours, Hale said. "Do it. Thomas, can you have Whitfield here by 3? I'll have him here by 2, Thomas said, already moving. "Then we have the afternoon." Samuel looked at Clara. "And tonight, we're going to do something we haven't done since this started." She looked at him. "What?" "Eat a proper supper," he said. "Sit at this table without papers on it, and let tomorrow's problems be tomorrow's problems." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then, for the first time genuinely without restraint, she smiled. Not the controlled, almost smile he'd seen glimpses of. A real one, full and unguarded. The smile of someone who has been careful for so long that the simple permission to stop being careful for 5 minutes lands like something extraordinary. It lasted only a moment before she pulled it back. But Samuel had seen it, and it was without question the most honest thing he had ever witnessed. "All right," she said. "Supper, without papers." "Deal," he said. Outside, Pete was crossing the yard toward the barn, and he stopped when he saw through the kitchen window that both of them were standing up, and the room had a different quality than it had had an hour ago. He couldn't have explained what he was reading, just that the boss had a look on his face that Pete hadn't seen in a very long time. Something settled, something sure. Pete nodded to himself and kept walking. Some things he'd learned in 60 years of living didn't need to be understood completely to be recognized. And what he'd just seen through a kitchen window on a Wyoming afternoon was 2 people who had started as strangers, and practical arrangements and cautious negotiations arriving at the same place from different directions. Not the same as arriving at the same place by design. Better, actually. Because what you found by accident was the thing you hadn't known you were looking for, and you held on to it differently than the thing you'd planned. Tighter, more careful, more sure of its value. Pierce still had his hotel room and his lawyers and his expired document and his emergency Boston motion. But Samuel Dawson had something considerably more difficult to defeat. He had a woman who wanted to stay, and he had an entire community that had just spent the better part of a week deciding whose side it was on. The supper happened. It was a plain meal: salt pork, boiled potatoes, cornbread that Clara made herself because she had discovered 3 weeks ago that cooking was one of the few activities that required enough physical attention to quiet the part of her mind that never fully stopped working. Samuel set the table without being asked, which he always did, and they sat across from each other with no papers between them for the first time in days, and ate without talking about Pierce or Caldwell or Boston courts or land surveys. They talked about the ranch, about the Northfield and what it might look like in spring if the Harmon lease went through and the cattle numbers started recovering. Samuel told her about his father building the barn and getting the measurements wrong on the east wall, and having to rebuild it twice, which was the kind of story that was both genuinely funny and quietly painful, the way most stories about fathers were. Clara told him about the one time she had successfully argued with Gerald Fitch about an estate decision, and Fitch had told her afterward that she had her father's ability to make an unreasonable position sound inevitable. She'd taken it as the highest possible compliment. Fitch had meant it that way. Hale had gone to the hotel with 4 affidavits drafted, signed, and notarized, Samuel's, Clara's, Thomas's, and Judge Whitfield's, the last carrying the particular authority of a retired circuit judge, who had written in his precise and unsparing legal language that he had observed the Dawson marriage at close range and found it to be genuine, practical, and conducted with evident mutual respect, which he considered more than sufficient foundation for a lasting union, and considerably more than he had observed in many formally arranged marriages of his professional experience. Whitfield had signed it with a flourish that suggested he had enjoyed writing every word. Thomas had reported before he left that Caldwell had withdrawn the preliminary notice at 2 in the afternoon. Formally. In writing. With a letter to Samuel's address that was so carefully neutral in its language that it was almost a work of art in the genre of institutional self-protection. The Harmon lease was signed in full. 12 months renewable with a per-head rate that gave Samuel's operation its first reliable secondary income in 3 years. Hale had filed the response to Pierce's adverse possession claim at the Territorial Land Office at noon. He had also filed the motion for federal court oversight of the Wyoming proceedings, citing the interstate nature of the Whitmore estate. The Territorial Land Officer, a quiet man named Birch, who had apparently been waiting for someone to challenge Pierce's filing since the moment it crossed his desk, had accepted both documents with what Hale described as conspicuous relief. So the evening was by any reasonable measure a moment of genuine progress. And yet, Samuel ate his supper and watched Clara across the table and knew because he had learned to read her in the specific, detailed way you learn to read land. You worked every day that she was still carrying something. Not the legal situation, she had made her peace with the legal situation, or at least reached the stage where she had done everything she could do today and had filed the rest under tomorrow's problems. Something else. He waited until after supper, when the dishes were done, and Clara was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in front of her, looking at nothing in particular. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked up, considered deflecting. Didn't. "What happens if it doesn't work?" she said. He sat down across from her. "Define doesn't work." "The Boston court takes Pierce's emergency motion seriously. The affidavits aren't enough. A judge decides to appoint temporary guardianship while the betrothal question is investigated." She looked at her coffee. "The estate gets frozen. The Wyoming claim gets tied up in the same proceedings. We're in litigation for 2 years. "We've been in it for 2 days and we're still here," Samuel said. 2 years is different from 2 days. "I know that." He looked at her steadily. "I'm still asking what happens if it doesn't work. What happens to you?" She was quiet for a moment. "I've lost before. I know how to lose and start again." "That's not what I'm asking." She looked at him. "I'm asking what you want," he said. "Not what you'll do if the worst happens. What you want if everything goes the way it should go. What does that look like to you?" Clara held his gaze. "This," she said quietly, "this is what it looks like. This kitchen, this table, this ranch. The north field when the cattle numbers come back. The work." A pause. "You." Samuel held her gaze for a long moment. "Then that's what we're working toward," he said. "Samuel, I don't need the legal situation to be simple," he said. "I've had a note against my land for 3 years and a failing herd and 2 bad winters, and I didn't leave. I'm not leaving now because someone in Boston is making things complicated." He paused. "Are you?" She looked at him. "No," she said. "Good," he said. For the 3rd time. in exactly the same tone as the first two. And Clara, for the second time that day, smiled, the real one, the unguarded one, and this time she didn't pull it back. Shimweg. Pierce made his move the next morning. He came to the ranch again. Not alone this time, he brought Greer, his lawyer, and a man Samuel didn't recognize, who had the specific look of someone employed to write things down and make the writing official. Samuel was in the yard. He had known Pierce was coming. Thomas had sent Hector out at 7 with a note saying Pierce had ordered a wagon from the livery at dawn, and he had made certain decisions about how this morning was going to go. He had sent Clara inside with specific instructions. She had looked at him when he gave them. "You want me to stay inside?" she said. "I want you to listen from the window," he said. "And I want Pierce to believe you're afraid to face him." Clara had studied him for a moment. "You have something planned?" "I have something that might work," he said. "But it only works if he thinks he has the upper hand when he gets here." She had gone inside. Now Samuel stood in the yard and watched Pierce's wagon come up the road, and he kept his expression exactly what it normally was. Plain direct, neither welcoming nor hostile. And he waited. Pierce climbed down from the wagon with the ease of a man who was comfortable arriving places as though he owned them. Greer followed. The third man stayed in the wagon. "Mr. Dawson," Pierce said. The warmth from the church meeting was gone. He'd recalibrated overnight. "I think it's time for a direct conversation." "All right," Samuel said. "Have one." Pierce studied him. "The affidavits your lawyer filed yesterday are a creative response, but they don't address the core legal question, which is whether your marriage was entered into while a prior agreement was still operative." "Your prior agreement expired," Samuel said. "Clara's lawyer has the correspondence." "Clara's lawyer has a self-serving interpretation of correspondence," Pierce said smoothly. "The actual legal question will be decided by a court, and courts, Mr. Dawson, respond to documents." He paused. "I have a document. You have affidavits from people who are by definition friendly to your position." Samuel looked at him. "What do you want?" Pierce let the directness land. Then he said, "I want Clara to come home." "She is home." "I want her to come back to Boston, to properly manage her estate, to step away from this." He looked at the ranch with a brief, controlled expression that managed to be dismissive without being obviously rude situation. "And if she doesn't, then I spend whatever it takes to make the legal proceedings last long enough that the practical cost of staying here outweighs the emotional appeal of it." Pierce said it plainly as a statement of available resources rather than a threat. "I have the funding. I have the lawyers. I have a document that raises a legitimate legal question. I don't need to win decisively. I only need to make the alternative expensive enough." Samuel was quiet. He looked at Pierce steadily, the way he looked at things he was deciding about, the way he'd looked at the North Field before he decided to lease it, the way he'd looked at the letter from the marriage agency before he decided to send it. "Greer," Samuel said. Pierce's lawyer looked up. "Under Wyoming territorial law," Samuel said, "what's the statutory penalty for filing a fraudulent adverse possession claim on land that can be demonstrated to be under active management?" Greer blinked. The penalties vary by..." "The Territorial Land Office can tell you specifically," Samuel said. "Hale filed our documentation yesterday afternoon, including Pete Garland's 15-year work log, which documents 4 years of continuous active use of the parcels your client claimed were in abandonment." He paused. "Including the testimony of Jacob Harmon, who grazed his own cattle on those same parcels 2 summers ago, under a temporary arrangement with me, which he has now given sworn statement about." Pierce was very still. "Your adverse possession claim," Samuel said, "is not just legally weak. It is potentially fraudulent, because whoever filed it on your behalf had to certify that the land was demonstrably unmanaged, and that certification, given what's in Pete's work log, was either made without adequate investigation or made with knowledge that it was false." Pierce looked at him. The warm manner had not returned, but the cold manner underneath it was more interesting. Samuel could see the calculation running the reassessment the way a man who played chess thought 3 moves ahead and had just been told that the move he'd already made was going to cost him a piece. "You've been busy," Pierce said. "My wife has been busy," Samuel said. "I've been trying to keep up." Pierce looked at the house. At the closed door behind which he now understood Clara was not hiding, but listening. "The betrothal document," Pierce said, shifting, trying a different angle, "is an expired preliminary agreement with 12 unmet conditions," Samuel said, "which Clara's lawyer documented at the time, and which Hale will demonstrate in federal court when the consolidated proceeding is scheduled." He paused. "You moved the Wyoming claim to try to keep it in territorial court, where you've spent a week building local relationships. We filed for federal oversight yesterday morning. That ship has sailed." Pierce looked at him for a long time. Samuel waited. He was not a man who filled silence, and he was not filling it now. "She told you everything," Pierce said finally. "She told me what mattered," Samuel said. "And she told me when she was ready, which is how it works between people who trust each other." Something moved across Pierce's face, very briefly. It might have been if Samuel was reading it right, and he thought he was something close to the specific defeat of a person who has spent years operating in a world where trust is a vulnerability and has just encountered evidence that sometimes it's the opposite. "This doesn't have to be adversarial," Pierce said. "One more attempt, quieter this time. Clara's estate is significant. The management of it is complex. I am not her enemy. You filed an adverse possession claim on her land," Samuel said. 3 weeks before you arrived here, before you even saw the property or spoke to her." He kept his voice even, not angry, just factual. "What would you call that?" Pierce had no answer for that. The man in the wagon had stopped pretending to look elsewhere and was watching openly now. Greer was looking at his own boots. Pierce looked at the house one more time. Then he said quietly to no one in particular, "She always was her father's daughter." And he turned and got back into the wagon. Samuel watched them drive away. He stood in the yard for another full minute after the wagon was out of sight, just breathing, letting the specific pressure of that confrontation drain out of him, the way cold drained out of your hands when you came inside from working in winter. Then the house door opened and Clara came out. She walked to where he was standing and stood beside him, not touching, just present, looking at the empty road. "You didn't need me there," she said. "I needed you to hear it," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "He'll file the Boston motion anyway." "Probably." "And we'll spend months dealing with it." "Probably," he said again. She looked at him. "You don't seem particularly worried." "I'm worried," he said. "I'm just not surprised. Men like Pierce don't stop the first time you push back. Maybe not the second either." He paused. "But every time he pushes and we push back, the position gets clearer. The evidence gets more established. Hale says federal courts respond to clarity." Clara nodded slowly. "Hale is right, and Whitfield has offered to connect Hale to a federal judge in Cheyenne, who he says is his word intolerant of estate manipulation by former trustees." Samuel almost smiled. He used that word specifically. Clara looked at the road. "Nathaniel is going to have a difficult time in front of a federal judge who has already been personally briefed by a retired circuit court judge with strong opinions." "That was my read too," Samuel said. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What did he say?" "When he left. I didn't hear the last part." Samuel looked at her. "He said you were your father's daughter." She absorbed that. And for a moment, just a moment, something crossed her face that was not the fight, and not the strategy, and not the careful management of a complex situation. Something older and quieter, and, "He hated that about me," she said softly. "My father. He always said Robert Whitmore was the one man he couldn't outmaneuver." She paused. "I used to wonder if that was why he resented me. Because I reminded him of losing." "Maybe," Samuel said. "Or maybe he resented you because you were better at it than he was, and you were 20 years younger." She looked at him. "Either way," he said, "I'll take it as a compliment. She laughed a real one, short and surprised, and she didn't pull that back either. The Boston motion was filed on a Friday. Hale received the official notice by telegraph that afternoon and rode out to the ranch to deliver it in person, which told Samuel it was either better or worse than expected. It was better. Pierce's legal team is good, Hale said, sitting at the kitchen table with the telegram in front of him. But they filed in a hurry because they wanted to move before our federal oversight motion was processed. And when lawyers file in a hurry, they make choices. He looked at Clara. They led with the betrothal argument, front and center, which means they've decided it's their strongest piece. Is that bad? Samuel asked. It's bad for them, Hale said, because leading with your strongest piece when the opposition has had 48 hours to prepare a response to that specific piece means you've given up the element of surprise. He set the telegram down. Your lawyer in Boston, Fitch, has had 2 days since your wire to prepare the documentation showing the agreement lapsed. He's good. I spoke to him this morning. He's very good, and he's angry. Gerald is always angry when someone files against his clients, Clara said. He's particularly angry this time, Hale said. He used the words professionally insulting to describe Pierce's argument. A pause. I found that encouraging. Clara looked at the telegram. Timeline. The Boston court has scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 weeks from today, Hale said. That's fast for a court proceeding, which tells me the judge is taking the federal oversight request seriously and wants to determine jurisdiction before too much happens. He paused. There's something else. They waited. The Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne sent notice this morning, Hale said. They have opened a formal review of Pierce's adverse possession filing, on the grounds that the certification of abandonment may have been made without adequate investigation. He looked at Samuel. Pete's work log. Samuel nodded. A formal review means Pierce's claim is suspended pending the outcome, Hale said. He cannot advance it. He cannot build on it. The 900 acres are legally frozen in place, which means neither Pierce nor anyone acting on his behalf can do anything with that land while the review is active. Clara straightened. How long does a formal review take? She said. Minimum 60 days, often longer. Hale almost smiled, the restrained smile of a man who respected legal procedure and was watching it work correctly. And during those 60 days, any evidence of active management of the land strengthens the landowner's position and weakens the claim's foundation further. Clara looked at Samuel. Samuel looked at Clara. The Northfield, she said. In spring, he said. With the Harmon cattle on it and our own herd expanded, that land is going to look extremely actively managed. Yes, she said. It is. Hale looked between them with the expression of someone who had handled a great many legal cases and was finding this particular one unusually satisfying. I'll be in Cheyenne through the weekend, he said, standing up. I have additional filings to complete. But I want to say something before I go. He looked at Clara. I've practiced land law in this territory for 12 years. I have seen Eastern operators come west and use legal complexity to take what isn't theirs from people who don't have the resources to fight back effectively. He paused. This is the first time I have watched the situation run in the other direction. I want you to know I find it professionally gratifying. Thank you, Mr. Hale, Clara said. Don't thank me, he said. Just win. He left. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Then Samuel said, We're going to win. Not a question, not a calculation. Just a statement, the way he stated things he had decided were true. Clara looked at him. You sound sure. I am sure, he said. Not because everything is resolved, because Pierce came here thinking he was dealing with a woman alone in a place she didn't know, and he was wrong about both parts of that. She held his gaze. He was wrong about the alone part, she said quietly. Yeah, Samuel said. He was. 3 weeks later, Samuel and Clara rode to Cheyenne together. The federal hearing was not dramatic in the way that fights that have been building for months sometimes are. There was no gallery, No theatrical revelation. No moment of sudden reversal. It was a federal courtroom with a judge named Alcott, who was 62 years old, had been on the bench for 20 years, and had, as Whitfield had promised, a documented professional hostility toward what he called the abuse of trust arrangements for personal enrichment. Pierce's legal team presented the betrothal argument first. Fitch dismantled it in 40 minutes with documentation so thorough that at one point, Judge Alcott asked Pierce's lead attorney to explain how he had certified the agreement as operative, when the correspondence in the record so clearly indicated its expiration, and the attorney's answer was not satisfying to anyone in the room, including by his expression himself. Pierce's team pivoted to the abandonment argument for the Wyoming land. Hale presented Pete Garland's work log. He presented Jacob Harmon's sworn statement. He presented the survey records, the creek crossing repair, the washout work from 1883. He presented as his final document a letter from Robert Whitmore's original surveyor still living in Boston, located by Fitch through 3 weeks of determined searching, confirming that Whitmore had intended the Wyoming parcel as a permanent family holding, specifically referenced in correspondence with his surveyor as land for my daughter's future. Land for my daughter's future. Clara heard those words in a federal courtroom in Cheyenne, Wyoming, 32 years after her father had written them to a surveyor he trusted, and she sat very still with her hands folded on the table and did not let her face do anything that wasn't appropriate for a courtroom. But underneath the table, Samuel's hand found hers. She held it. Judge Alcott took 40 minutes to deliberate. He returned and delivered his ruling in the measured, precise language of a federal judge who had made up his mind before he left the room and was now articulating the reasoning for the record. The betrothal argument was dismissed. The agreement was found to have lapsed by operation of its own terms. The Dawson marriage was affirmed as valid and uncontested. The adverse possession claim was denied. The land had not been abandoned. The evidence of management, both historical and current, was sufficient to defeat the claim under territorial and federal standard. Nathaniel Pierce's petition for temporary guardianship was denied. The court found no evidence of incapacity or mismanagement. The court found specifically that the decision to relocate to Wyoming, enter a practical marriage, and take active steps to manage the estate's western holdings demonstrated precisely the kind of sound, independent judgment that the original trust had been designed to support. And finally, the part that Fitch had worked toward for 11 years and that Clara had believed was possible for 8 and had stopped being certain about for 3, the court issued a formal order that any future attempt by Nathaniel Pierce or any agent acting on his behalf to challenge Clara Whitmore Dawson's authority over the Whitmore estate would be considered harassment and treated accordingly. It was over. Clara sat in the federal courtroom in Cheyenne and let that land in her body, the way you let something land when you have been braced against it for so long that the release of the bracing is almost as significant as the thing itself. Over. She felt Samuel beside her, the solid, uncomplicated presence of him. "All right," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. And she meant it in a way she had not meant the word all right in a very long time. Pierce left Redstone Valley on the morning stage 3 days after the hearing. Thomas was there to watch him go, not out of malice, but out of the natural human impulse to witness the conclusion of things. He told Samuel that Pierce had boarded the stage without speaking to anyone, had looked out the window as it pulled away, and had not looked back at the town. "He'll try something else eventually," Thomas said. "Men like that don't stop." "Maybe," Samuel said, "but the federal order makes it expensive, and Pierce runs calculations. When the calculation doesn't favor him, he moves to something else." He paused. "Clara's lawyer is filing to have him formally removed as any interested party to the estate. Permanently. Fitch has been building that case for 3 years. Thomas nodded. "And Caldwell. Caldwell is doing what Caldwell does, calculating." Samuel looked toward the bank. He withdrew the notice. He cooperated with the territorial review. He's trying to come out of this without damage. Will he manage it? Depends on how many other people's notes he's called in the same way, Samuel said. Ben Hooper has retained a lawyer of his own. The territorial governor's office has the complaint we filed. He paused. That's beyond what I can control. You sound remarkably calm about all of it, Thomas said. Samuel looked at him. I'm tired, Tom. I've been running on tired for 3 weeks. The calm is mostly just there's nothing left to spend on being agitated. Thomas looked at him for a moment. Then he said, How is she? Good, Samuel said. And then more honestly, better than good. She's planning. Planning what? Everything, Samuel said. The Northfield expansion. A proposal she's putting together to the estate lawyers about formally transferring the Wyoming parcel into a joint holding with the ranch. A letter to the Cheyenne Land Development Office about a road easement that might improve access to the north boundary. He paused. She asked Pete yesterday if he'd be willing to train 2 additional hands in the spring. Pete said yes before she finished the sentence. Thomas laughed the full wall-shaking laugh. She has Pete. She's had Pete since week 2, Samuel said. He just didn't admit it until recently. Thomas sobered slightly and looked at Samuel with the directness of a 30-year friendship. Are you happy, Sam? Samuel was quiet for a moment. He thought about the silence that had lived in his house for 6 years. The specific weight of it. He thought about the morning the stagecoach arrived and a woman with one small suitcase and mended cuffs had walked toward him without hesitation and said, I hope we can build something honest together. He thought about ledgers and work logs and telegraph offices at midnight and a federal courtroom in Cheyenne and the warmth of a hand held under a table when words weren't sufficient. Yeah, he said. I'm happy. Thomas nodded once. The nod of a man who had hoped for this for a long time. Good, he said. Spring came to Redstone Valley the way it always did. Not gently, not dramatically, but practically, the way all important things came in Wyoming. The cold broke over 2 weeks, and the ground softened, and the grass started coming back in the Northfield, and with the Harmon cattle rotating through it, and Samuel's own herd growing for the first time in 3 years, the land looked like what it had always had the potential to be. Clara stood at the northern boundary of the ranch one morning in April, and looked out at the 900 acres that stretched beyond it, her father's land, which was now hers. In every sense the law could articulate, and which she had decided was not going to be sold or developed or leveraged into something abstract. It was going to be ranched. It was going to be worked by people who knew it and cared about it, which in practice meant an expanded Dawson operation with additional hands and a cattle rotation that would take 2 years to fully establish, but which, according to the projections she and Samuel had worked out over 3 separate evenings at the kitchen table, would make the combined operation financially self-sustaining within 18 months and genuinely profitable within 3 years. She heard Samuel come up beside her. She'd heard his step for 5 months now and recognized it the way you recognize sounds that had become part of the rhythm of your day. Hale's final filing went through, he said. The joint holding is registered. The 900 acres and the ranch are formally under the same title structure. Your name and mine, she said. Both of ours, he said. She looked out at the land. I keep thinking about what my father wrote, she said. To the surveyor, land for my daughter's future. She paused. He didn't know what that future would look like. He just bought the land and held it and trusted that if he held it long enough, the right thing would happen with it. He was right, Samuel said. He was. She was quiet for a moment. I've been thinking about what this year would have looked like if I'd told you everything from the beginning, when I stepped off the stagecoach. Different, Samuel said. Better or worse? He thought about it honestly the way he thought about things. I don't know. Different. We'd have skipped some of the fear. He paused. But we might have skipped some of the other things too. The things you learn about a person when the situation is hard enough to strip everything unnecessary away. Clara looked at him. What did you learn? That you're the most capable person I've ever been in the same room with, he said. And that you're also someone who needed just once for a person to see that before they saw anything else. He paused. I was glad I could be that person, even if I didn't know I was doing it at the time. She held his gaze. "What did you learn?" he asked. She looked at the land. At the boundary marker, old wood worn smooth where his property and her father's property met and were now legally and practically and in every way that mattered the same thing. "That honest is not the same as simple," she said quietly. "I came here looking for honesty. I thought that was the whole answer. Find an honest man, build an honest life. Simple." She paused. "It isn't simple. You are an honest man, and this has been the most complicated 5 months of my life." She looked at him. "But the honesty is what made the complexity survivable. Every time something went wrong, the one thing I was never uncertain about was you." Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "The one thing," he said. "The most important thing," she said. He reached out and took her hand, the same simple gesture as the courtroom, except here in the April morning light of the Wyoming Territory, with the north field stretching out behind them, and the ranch house solid behind them, and Pete's hammer already going somewhere near the barn here. It was not comfort under pressure, but something else. Something that didn't need a name, because it had already become a fact. "We have a meeting with the Harmons at 2, he said. "I know," she said. "I scheduled it. And Hector wants to show you the spring rotation plan he drafted. He showed me this morning. It's good. He's been paying attention." "He has," Samuel said. "He wants to know if you'll look over his math." "I already corrected it and left it on his bunk." Samuel looked at her. "When did you do that?" "Before breakfast," she said. He shook his head, not in exasperation, but in the specific quiet way of a person who has stopped being surprised by something and started being grateful for it instead. They stood there for another minute, the two of them at the boundary line, where two pieces of land had become one thing, where a lonely cowboy's struggling ranch and a hidden heiress's forgotten inheritance had turned out to be in the way that the best things sometimes were exactly what each of them needed to complete the other. Then Clara said, "We should go in. I want to review the land transfer documents before the Harmon meeting." "Of course you do," Samuel said. She started walking back toward the house. He fell into step beside her. "Samuel," she said without stopping. "Yeah. Thank you for writing that letter." He looked at her sideways. "Which one?" "The first one," she said. "To the agency. The honest one." A pause. "Every good thing that has happened to me in the past 5 months started with that letter." Samuel walked beside her in the April morning and thought about a man sitting alone at a desk with a piece of paper trying to find the right words for what he needed, deciding to simply tell the truth because he didn't know how to do anything else. "You wrote back," he said. "Of course I did," she said. It was the only honest letter in 17. He almost smiled. Then he did smile, the full one, the one that had been there all along underneath the plain surface of Samuel Dawson, the one that belonged to a man who had been waiting without knowing he was waiting for a reason to use it. "Come on," he said. "Let's go look at those documents." And they walked back to the house together, through the April light on the land that was theirs, built out of loss and stubbornness, and practical letters and hard winters, and one woman's courage and one man's honesty. And in Redstone Valley, Wyoming Territory, in the year 1886. That was enough. More than enough. It was everything. In a world that measured people by what they owned, Samuel and Clara Dawson had built something rarer and more durable than fortune. A life where two people had seen each other clearly, chosen each other honestly, and held on through every force that tried to take that choice apart. That was not luck. That was not inheritance. That was something they had made themselves from the ground up, the way everything worth keeping has always been made one honest decision at a time, until the foundation was solid enough to stand on forever.